Good afternoon. Welcome to the President's Council. I would like to point out that this is, from my point of view, this is the last President's Council meeting that I'll be presiding over. We created the President's Council many years ago when the college very first started, and it served a number of purposes during the year. It was, in fact, a sort of farm team for the Board of Trustees for quite a while, and it's provided a great deal of advice and counsel as we go. So it will be transitioning to a new leader. We'll have a meeting in the spring, but I think the team is planning to use that for something else. So this will be the last sort of regular President's Council meeting, and therefore its content is a little different than usual. You've seen the agenda. I think by now we'll have 3 sessions, sort of past, present, and future, and we'll get into that in a minute. What I'd like to do now is to invite Ken Stokes to make a few remarks of welcome.
Thank you, Rick. Up here more quickly than I thought. I just wanted to add my welcome on behalf of the Board of Trustees to our new attendees, whoever you are out there. I think Rick will probably come around to introducing some of you in a few minutes, and those longtime and loyal attendees as well. From my perspective, well, let me start by saying these are interesting times at Olin. We're in the midst of a presidential search to replace Rick, find his successor. We've had a number of leadership transitions that occurred earlier this year, so there's lots of things aflux. I see one of the leaders who has stepped down is just smiling at me when I made that comment. Lots of things in flux and lots of balls in the air as people adjust to new structures and new roles. But that's kind of the way Olin has always been. Things have always been changing anyway, and so this is just perhaps more change than we've had in a couple of decades, but it makes for exciting times. As part of the presidential search process, the community has engaged in a number of introspection and conversation sessions to figure out where we've been, where we want to go, what we should be looking for in a new president. And I think today's discussion is yet another in that series of introspection. I don't know if it was planned that way or coincidental, but I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to look to the past, look to the present, and perhaps look to the future today. Whenever I've heard Larry talk about the inspiration and the founding of Olin, and I've heard it more than once, I always learn something new. And I don't know if it's because I listen differently or I just build on what he's saying and I pick it up differently, but this is always one of my great pleasures is being able to hear Larry talk about the pre-days at Olin, or before the institution even started up. The other speakers we have today are all what I would describe as people that have up-close and personal relationships with Olin from a multitude of perspectives. And so I think it's going to make for an interesting series of discussions this afternoon. All I can say is thanks for being here. I hope that the afternoon lives up to my expectations. I'm pretty sure it will. Hope it lives up to yours as well. And let's get on with the show, but I know Rick's got some more comments he'd like to make first. Again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ken. I want to begin with a moment of silence for one of the first members of the President's Council. It's Professor Woody Flowers from MIT, who was an amazing member of our community. So let's just reflect for a few seconds about Woody. I still remember the first time that I personally met Woody Flowers. This was in the fall of 1971. I arrived at MIT as a first-year master's student in mechanical engineering. Woody was an instructor at that point, finishing his PhD thesis, which would happen a couple of years later. We were in the same lab, so I could see what he was doing with robotics at that time. This was so different from my own background in engineering, particularly mechanical engineering from the University of California, that having kids build things and compete with them before having all of the prerequisite courses in mechatronics just seemed outrageous. And it worked so well. When I eventually returned to Needham in 1999 with the task of trying to start a new college from a blank sheet, Woody was the first person I called. I need help, Woody. Where do you find people that think like you? Woody had a really profound impact on the school beyond what you may have seen by his comments in the auditorium. I talked to Gil Pratt recently, who was one of our founding faculty members. Gil is now the CEO of Toyota Research Institute in Silicon Valley. Gil told me that when he was looking for another place to go from MIT, Woody encouraged him to think about Olin. And this had a profound impact on his career. And I know there are many people at Olin who have the same sort of experience with Woody. So this is a profound loss. With all else that's going on at Olin, I can tell you that I'm personally struggling with the emotional dimension of this, and I'm just compartmentalizing it like so many other people are until we have time. We miss Woody. We have a number of other people who are first-timers at Olin, who are not part of the Olin community, and today is their first arrival, and I want to acknowledge that before we get started. One of them is John Werner. John, are you here? Well, he's planned to be here, so I'll tell you a little bit about John Werner, just a very little. He is currently at the Media Lab at MIT as a VP for Strategic Partnerships. John is also Boston Innovation's 50 on Fire Award in 2014. He's an incredibly powerful networker and advocate for technology and education in the area. So when he comes, we'll be glad to welcome him. In addition to that, I believe we have Greg Stucklosa here. Yes, Greg, welcome. He's a program manager for educational experiences at Autodesk. Autodesk has been a really profound partner for Olin from the beginning, and thank you for coming and for supporting our program. Okay, without any more preliminaries, I'd like to get started with these two people who are sitting up here in the front. We've been ignoring them until now. I'd like to talk a little bit more about why they're here and what they're going to do. One of them should be very familiar to anybody who's visited Olin because his portrait is in the lobby as you walk in, right next to Mr. Olin's, okay? And that's my dear friend and mentor, Larry Milas. Larry, of course, was the president of the F.W. Olin Foundation for many years, and through his leadership, higher education in the country has been affected for generations. I believe that the Olin Foundation is responsible for giving 78 buildings on 58 university campuses around the country, including places like Cornell, like Johns Hopkins, like Vanderbilt, like University of Southern California, like Babson. I could go on and on. Luckily for us, he, leading the board, chose to make a change in the direction of their philanthropy and to create an entirely new college, and you'll hear all about that from Larry. So Larry, we're so grateful that you would make the trip up here and take the time to share with us. He's going to be interviewed today by a member of our staff, Anne-Marie Dorning. Anne-Marie is currently Associate Vice President for Marketing and Communication at Olin, but she is a rare talent. She has a background at ABC News and at NBC News, where she has done things like covering the Olympics. She's an experienced interviewer. It's very rare for a small college to have a talent like this on our team. So welcome to both of you, and I'll let you begin.
Wow. Well, that was quite an introduction, so thank you for that, and thank you for your personal reflections on Woody Flowers, who I know many of you knew personally. And Ken, you talked a little bit about how this is a year of transition for Olin, and in thinking about the President's Council, we thought who better to reflect on the past 20 years of Olin than the person who more than really anybody is responsible for Olin coming into being. So that's where I want to start, going back to the beginning with our conversation. So as we think about your decision to dissolve, or the group's decisions to dissolve the Olin Foundation and build a college and how it began to take shape, you said that you knew the new college needed a niche, and it took you just an hour to figure out what that might be. So why don't you sort of talk us through that process?
Well, the hour relates to after completing the third visit of 3 visits. It was obviously an undertaking like dissolving the foundation and putting all the money into a new college is something that demands some planning. So the first stop I made in trying to plan was to visit Hank Riggs at Harvey Mudd College. I wanted to get his thoughts on how what he thought of the idea of starting a new engineering college on the East Coast, hopefully at Babson, at least next door to Babson, and so I went out to see him. Well, I didn't get a lot of feedback from him. Little did I know that at that time he was also planning to create a new institution that would be part of the Claremont colleges, that would be the Keck, I'm not sure, life sciences, something like that, a graduate program. But he said, well, you know, I read an article recently by John Prados, who eventually became one of our really wonderful trustees here at the college. And John was a distinguished professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and he had just stepped down, I think, as president of ABET. So Hank dug up the article and he said, here, he said, this is the guy. So I got back to my office in New York and called up John Prados and said, I'd like to come out and talk to you.
What did he tell you?
He said, come on out. And we arranged a meeting. And then he said, I talked to him about it. And then he said, you know, he said, there's somebody else you should see. You should go to see Joe Bordogna. He's the head of the engineering programs at the National Science Foundation.
And is he the one that really framed things for you?
Joe is the one who pulled it all together. And in 1 hour, he was very disciplined about his time. He gave me 1 hour. And he laid out exactly what NSF was doing to try to reform engineering so that it could work successfully in the 21st century.
And what were those top 3 things that he told you?
Well, there were all the things that that help define the Olin engineering program: work in teams, learn by doing. There were other things like improve students' communication skills, hopefully bring in a foreign experience, international experience, and there were a number of things like that that were things that Joe Bordogna had mentioned would be important.
And I imagine that, so you have this idea to dissolve the foundation and start a new college. I imagine there were a few naysayers around. So what kinds of things did you hear from the naysayers? What did they tell you?
Well, the naysayers on the foundation board were concerned about the risk. Well, how is this going to turn out okay? I mean, take all this money and put it into one thing like that? So there was that. And then there were naysayers after it was became known to the public about, why are you doing another engineering school? Why don't you just give us the money? So they were, you just had to ignore it and go forward. I had no doubt that Olin would succeed.
Well, I was just going to ask you that. So you never had, you had no doubts?
No doubts, and I knew we would be of very high quality, but I must say, and I'm grateful to everybody here who has helped the college advance in so many different ways for their contributions. It wouldn't have been possible without all of that support and help. Deeply appreciative.
So you're not an engineer, but you've spent much of your career immersed in the workings of an engineering school. But I know that your own experience at college kind of informed some of your thoughts on the creation of Olin. So tell me how did that work? Tell me about your own experience as an undergrad.
Well, I had some difficulties in paying for my college education, and so I went into the military to get the GI Bill. That was my solution. That was my way of paying for college. And in fact, you might say Olin College is the product of the GI Bill. So tuition and the cost was something that was certainly on my mind. I have also not been supportive of the way tuition is funded these days. I was never a big supporter of using annual appeals in order to finance financial aid. I don't want to go on too long about this, but anyway, I used to make the prediction that it's a house of cards that will collapse because you keep increasing tuition so that you can keep funding financial aid, and sooner or later it all has to collapse. My prediction was, and still is, that sooner or later every freshman class will need a Saudi prince to pay the tuition for everyone else.
You went to Babson.
After I got out of the military, I went to Babson, that's right.
And what was your experience like there?
I had a wonderful time at Babson. I enjoyed myself. I learned a lot, and just it was wonderful.
I think you said that the community, the not leaving anybody behind, was important to you.
Yes. Well.
And that informed actually how the dorms here were built.
That's correct. I felt that I knew that engineering was a very intense program. Students would be under a lot of pressure. And it was important not to have anybody get lost in all of that. So the first residence hall was designed so that everyone would have a roommate, private bathrooms in each room, lounges and fireplaces on each floor.
So that a community could develop.
Yep. And I think it worked, although there were things, there were some changes creeping into society that and culture that I wasn't aware of, and so there was a demand for a different kind of residence hall when we built the next one.
So we're in the middle of a presidential search, and you have some experience with that. In fact, you said when we talked a little bit ago that it was just you.
Well, that's right. The board basically gave me the authority to just move ahead. If you want to do it, do it. And so I did.
Just so you know, we have a whole team of people here who are looking for the next Rick. So when you told me that when you initially met with Rick in Florida, you said, and this stuck with me, that you had no doubt that the day Olin opened its doors, it would be the leading engineering college in the country. But the trick would be to continue that 5 years, 10 years down the line.
Well, what I meant was that the academic program at Olin, I had no doubt, if we did the research and organized the faculty in the right way, we could have the leading engineering program from day one. But the question is, what will it look like 5 years later? And that's why the culture of constant innovation, I don't mean every day, but people need to be reflecting on what they're doing and keeping their eyes and ears open for new programs and new things that come along. So that's what it, as a non-engineer, that's what seemed important to me.
What has surprised you most about the school's evolution so far?
Well, that it has reached such a level of success. As I said, I always knew we could be successful. The question is, I had no right to imagine it would reach this level of success. It was basically, this was, I like to think that there's a little bit of Babson in the creation here, that this was entrepreneurship. And so anyway, I think that's probably surprised me the most.
Do you want to take just a minute to say, I told you so?
No, I don't think I need to do that.
Where do you still think there's progress to be made?
Well, I suppose this is both backward-looking and forward-looking. I would be very happy to see the full tuition scholarship restored. That's something that I feel strongly about, and maybe we can do that someday.
If you were to offer some thoughts or advice, if you were to talk with the next president of Olin, sort of what advice might you offer?
Well, keep your eyes and ears open, listen, think about what people tell you. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to agree with you, but it's important to listen and to let people know they're heard. Nobody expects you to agree with them 100% about everything. So I think that's important. I hope we get somebody who is as effective as Rick has been. He's been an extraordinary leader. He works harder than anybody else I've ever known. He's extremely intelligent and has been very good at networking and bringing others in to be exposed to the college. I think that's what's, we live in a world where you have to be known to be recognized. And Rick has really gone out and made Olin College known. I think that's been important.
You mentioned that it's difficult. So one of the reasons for founding Olin was that it's difficult to change a place that's already existing, right? So, but you can do a lot with a blank slate. Given that Olin is no longer a blank slate, where do you think the challenge lies for Olin?
Of maintaining that culture of constant innovation. That's where it is. The problem at so many, one of the reasons NSF didn't get a lot of return on taxpayer money that it was spreading out to try to reform engineering education is because everybody had turf. And existing institutions were happy to take the money, do a study. It would go into a volume on the shelf, and that was the end of it. This was a place where all of that became action.
So what is the key? So what's the difference here? What have you seen? Changing the curriculum?
Well, it's a combination of a lot of things, but curriculum is extremely important. Having the right kind of faculty, which we've been blessed to have. Faculty's been terrific. I think we've had some resources. I think the idea of even continuing to do a 50% tuition scholarship has been important. It gets people's attention, and I don't think going forward is a big problem.
So when you look ahead, so you don't think it's big?
No, I don't. I have lots of faith in the people here and whoever the new president will be to get it right.
And as you look ahead 5, 10, 20 years, where do you see Olin? Where would you like to see it?
Well, I would very much like it to be regarded as a leading edge, the leading edge small engineering college. I mean, there are lots of opportunities to go in some other directions. We could offer other degrees, for example, and expand our population. We could take on we are authorized, I believe, to do a graduate program, which we haven't done. So there are opportunities for some new things. But it'll be up to others to decide. But I think that what's really important is to keep the magic going. And the magic is the innovative spirit and not getting locked into what we do today is the right thing to do forever.
I know you said you had this certainty that it was going to be great, that it was going to take off, and that it was going to do well. But when did you know for sure? When did you know when it opened its doors, when you spoke at commencement? What was that moment?
Well, for sure. You mean the last 1%? Well, I don't know. It's hard to go back and, but there have been some wonderful moments. One when we made the public announcement, and the New York Times reported it. That was a huge day, and caused me to whoop it up a little bit. We've had celebrations, the dedication of the campus. I remember one groundbreaking we had, and we had a small group of guests that were maybe a dozen seats, and the president of Wellesley was there. I don't know if you remember this, Rick, but I made some remarks, and this had been part of the Babson campus, which we bought from Babson to build this campus. And this particular part where the groundbreaking was held was something that, when I was a student at Babson, was called the Bird Sanctuary. Now, nobody visited the Bird Sanctuary during the day. It was always at night. And it was considered hallowed ground. I wasn't sure if we were going to get any pushback from Babson students.
You actually said that the community, so I think you were talking about Claremont College in the beginning, and that you wanted to foster that sense of community between multiple colleges so that that would also contribute to the spirit of innovation. Do you see that here now in the
Yes,
Bow partnership?
absolutely. I think that's really an important aspect of the original planning. The foundation had funded a new academic building at Harvey Mudd College. That's how I got to know Hank Riggs. And I was quite taken with the whole arrangement of the Claremont colleges. Without going into a lot of detail, there are about 5 different institutions, maybe 6 today, that you walk across the street and you're on a different campus. Each college has its own focus, and they share a common library. So even though you have the intimacy of your own small college, you have a much broader community. The opportunities that come from taking a course at a different college, a more expanded faculty, opportunities to meet other students from other colleges. I thought it was terrific, and except for the 5 colleges in Northampton, that's not much, and I haven't heard a lot about them lately in their cooperation. I thought that this being next to Babson, because engineering and business are really basically on the same spectrum, they're just different ends of it. So I thought that having Olin next door to Babson was just a terrific way to go about this. Not only that, we had Wellesley in the neighborhood and Brandeis down in Waltham. So I saw lots of opportunity for that, and I think that that's something that can still be tapped into. I think that there's just great potential with the Babson connection, which is very important.
And Wellesley.
And Wellesley, yeah.
So I know that a lot of people want to ask questions, but I just have one final one for you, and that's what, as we sit in Milas Hall, what makes you most proud about this effort?
I think it's what the graduates, what I've heard them say they want to do. I think they've keyed into the idea that this is about making the world a better place. And I think that's really important. It's important to me and, of course, to all of us.
Well, thank you. All right. Yep.
So I want to tell all of you the rest of the story. I'm Ralph Sorensen. I was president of Babson from 1974 to 82, at a time when Babson had been counting on Roger Babson when he died to endow the place forevermore. Babson had never had a capital campaign. Babson didn't take any money from the government. And so we launched the first capital campaign where the goal was $12 million. And we were looking every place for help. And we heard about this F.W. Olin Foundation, which was building engineering buildings mainly around the country. But we had no contact with it at all. So the whole story starts with my sister, Nancy, who was the roommate of Nancy Horn at Northwestern University. And she said there's this Olin Foundation, and my roommate, Nancy, married Bill Horn, who was on the board of the Olin Foundation. His father, I think, was president of the board, wasn't he, at the time? So she provided an introduction to the Olin Foundation, and I went and visited in Minnesota, and they kind of liked the fact that Olin wasn't taking any, that Babson wasn't taking any money from the government. They were pretty conservative in their approach for life. And then we learned that Larry Milas was you were the lawyer for them, were you not? And so one thing led to another, and they made a grant to Babson for the Horn Library, which was named after the Horn father and son. And they made a gift of $4.2 million against our $12 million goal, which was the largest gift in the United States for a building that year, which we felt pretty good about. And then one thing led to another. Later, they gave a second gift to computerize and expand the Horn Library, and then they gave I think it was $30 million gift for the Olin graduate school MBA program at Babson. And then to the genius of Larry and of your president here, out of that came this decision to take the endowment. I think it was $600 million or something at the time, and to devote it all to creating this school, and the rest is history. But I think Olin has been especially lucky to have Rick as a guiding spirit and building all of the concepts into to Olin. I'd make one other observation at Babson. I'd been teaching at the Harvard Business School, and when I went to Babson, everybody was afraid I was going to try to Harvardize the place. It made no sense to do that, though. At that time, the Harvard Business School had 106 courses. One was called Management of New Enterprises. All the rest were focusing on developing the captains of industries that were going to head up IBM and those kinds of companies. So I then started looking at what the graduates of Babson were doing. A lot of them had founder after their name or president of small businesses, and light bulb went off, and we decided to pick the focus on entrepreneurship, and we opened that first Center for Entrepreneurship. But I think what's relevant for Olin is that what we did when we opened that Center for Entrepreneurship, we also set up something called the Symposium for Entrepreneurship Educators. So teaching the teachers. And I think that single program is probably responsible more than almost anything else for the fact that Babson is now, for 26 years, has been number one as far as entrepreneurship education. There have been over 3,500 people who are teaching entrepreneurship around the world who've gone through that program. And I think informally, Olin now has done the same thing. When you were asking how is it distinctive, I think you've had, how many people, Rick, have come through to try to learn from what you're doing? 2,000 or 3,000 or something. So Olin has had an immense impact on engineering education. When, for me, what's unique about it is all learning by doing, learning by projects. I've shared this story all over with so many people in terms of the power of the fact that students arrive as teams, they're given projects, design a robot by the end of freshman first semester, and as learning in a team setting by having faculty who are not tenured, who don't stand, they aren't sages on the stage, or they're not lecturing. It's all learning by doing. Anyway, I'll stop.
Someone else a chance to
Anyway, it's a great story.
ask a question.
I would say, just to follow up, that we had funded many, many buildings, the foundation had, but I don't think there was another college that made the same progress. That's my alma mater. From the time, same progress that Babson made from the time they decided to start raising money and have capital campaigns. It made a huge difference. Now, I must say that there is one college that has surpassed Babson. That's Olin.
I hope you were going to say I hope you were going to finish with that.
So we are truly blessed in that relationship, and I'm glad to hear that we also have a person who's willing to go on the road and do help with our fundraising and our friend raising from across the hill. But I wanted to turn back to some of the things that you've contributed, Larry, and the ways in which you've helped us move forward. We've spent a lot of time over the years talking about the things that enabled you to be brave, you and your team, to be brave and bold and to move in a direction that I think the world needed, and I certainly am incredibly grateful for. What motivated you, what drew you, what you thought you were creating here. We haven't spent as much time asking you, as the steward of a great opportunity of all the things that the F.W. Olin Foundation did over the many years and decades prior to the founding of this college, how you thought about what the values of that organization were and what was important to preserve in this new venture. Because as bold and as brave as you were to create this new thing, for which we are also grateful, you also infused us with things that were important from the prior version of F.W. Olin. And I'd like to hear about how we think as we move forward, as we change, how to not lose those values that are so critical to where we've been.
Okay, well, what was important, I guess is what you're asking.
And how did you
You know,
know?
we this isn't anything that's totally new to everybody, but we've talked about the Franklin Olin model. His life lived, it was a very Lincoln-esque kind of story. Raised, born in a mill town in Vermont, to a family of millwrights, and largely without any formal education, but he was mechanically gifted. Managed at beyond conventional age for entering college. Beyond that, was able to pass the entrance exam to Cornell. And he, at that time, of course, engineering education in the 1880s was quite different from what it is today. It was mostly earth moving, and maybe there were some mechanical things. And he went on to great success as an entrepreneur from engineering, and decided that he could do better what the people who had hired him could do. So he, anyway, as you know, and of course, one of the great footnotes to his life is he was a superb baseball player and played Major League Baseball while he was a student at Cornell. I think the amateur professional rules were quite different in those days. He's in the baseball encyclopedia, Frank Olin, and he hit over 300. So there you go. Here, I'm going to tell you one bit of
Trivia?
I'm going to trivia is name a college in the U.S. What college in the U.S. is named for a former Major League Baseball player?
So now we can all win a Trivial Pursuit.
All right. So, and then he went on, and there was a major article in Fortune magazine in 1950 or 49. They called him the $50 million Santa Claus. And it was an article about what he was planning to do with his fortune. And in any case, a lot of it went to the foundation that he had established in 1938. And so here is Frank Olin. Poor kid, grew up in Vermont, managed to get to Cornell, became an entrepreneur, put together a huge fortune. I understand that even after he had his fortune, he still put coins into the gas meter to whenever somebody complained that it wasn't warm enough in the room. So there he is, engineer, entrepreneur,
Baseball.
philanthropist.
So those are the values. Were those the values that you were asking about?
And athlete. You know, it could be a passionate pursuit, could be something other than just pure athletics. It could be music, the arts, whatever, helping people.
Rick has a question, and Vin has a question.
Larry, with your long experience being president of the Olin Foundation, you have watched philanthropy change America in many ways. I'm sort of curious what your views are on the role of philanthropy in American higher education and how that might compare with other countries.
Well, you know, philanthropy, one of the things that's been unique to America is the kind of philanthropy that we have. Government gives tax exemption even for contributions to all sorts of religions and beliefs. It's one thing I think is so important. De Tocqueville commented about philanthropy in the U.S. back in the 19th century when he visited America, and he talked about philanthropy and how unique it is here, so different in Europe and other parts. It almost doesn't exist because the government, the king, they took it on and did everything, and others didn't contribute much. So I think that the pluralism that comes from American philanthropy is so important. Otherwise, if the government did everything, it would all be politically motivated. How can I get the most votes if I have this money to give away? And as long as we preserve the opportunity to give money privately, get a tax deduction. It's a tremendous leveler, I think, but not everybody I know will agree with that.
That makes
That's
sense.
okay.
I think we have another question.
Larry, you've talked a lot about the number of academic people who helped influence Olin's beginning. I was wondering at the time that you were putting your thoughts together, who are the non-academics non-academics, the non-professors, the non-deans, not the folks from Harvey Mudd or NSF, who helped influence your thinking?
I don't know of any, frankly.
No, I ask that because so much of what you had thought about and sort of the foundational elements of the curriculum were driven by the voices outside of academia. So I was just wondering if there were particular people who helped articulate
On the
those voices.
non-academic side?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, we did have professionals in terms of the architects and space planners for the campus. All that was started even before Rick was hired, because we were trying to, as they say, fast track it. So Rick came in and sort of after that had already begun. But other than that, I don't think we had anybody. I mean, you know, I'd hear people might offer advice. Got some from the Board of Higher Education. The chairman of the Board of Higher Education, who had been appointed by the governor, took a big interest in the college and was happy to support it. So he offered some advice, but that mostly had to do with some
Process and getting things through.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, there's one just at the back.
Two.
All right, two more questions.
Larry, you've shared this with me before, but I would love to hear your thoughts on your success as a search committee of one. And I think everybody in this room would give you an A++ for your success in selecting Rick. How did you know that Rick was the right person to lead this mission?
Well, we had a search committee, and we had some, let's call them outsiders. I knew Sol Gittleman, who was provost at Tufts and a very admired academic person. He served on our search committee. John Prados also, I believe, was on the search committee. So but it wasn't, we made it clear that we would take a recommendation, but we wouldn't necessarily take a decision by the search committee. And so we went through that whole process. And there was another very strong candidate at the time, and we had to make a decision. And we ended up unanimously selecting Rick.
There's a certain leap of faith
yes.
aspect.
And I may have mentioned this to you, Bev, is that there's always, you know, no matter who you're hiring, there's always a leap of faith. You can see it on the paper. You can talk to the person and get references and all of that, but you don't really know until that person arrives and gets to work how it's going to go. But it didn't take long for Rick to remove any questions about our decision. And I wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, I just want to say thank you very much, and thanks for listening, and we'll see you all.
Well, it's time to reconvene with another conversation, which I think will be slightly different, with different perspectives. I think I'm looking forward to this because every person on this panel is somebody that has a really deep understanding of Olin, a deep understanding of engineering and engineering education globally, and a perspective on what Olin means globally and what Olin could be looking forward. So first I want to introduce our moderator, who really needs no introduction within Olin. It's Vin Mano, our provost since 2011 until just very recently. He's on sabbatical now. We reminded him that he's still an employee of the college, so we can recall him to do stuff like this. He's a fantastic partner and engineer. Actually, he's a nuclear engineer, I believe, and so that explains why he has this sort of radioactive personality that people are attracted to. So thank you, Vin, for coming back to do this. We also have Lynn Stein, who needs no introduction within the college. It's one of the founding faculty members at Olin. She is the person who, more than anyone else, is responsible for launching what we now call the Collaboratory in Olin's engagement with the rest of the world outside of the Oval, which is really terrific. We have Al Bunshaft, who is from Dassault Systems, a French company that is a global leader in software development and engineering. And I keep running into Al on different continents. We were just talking about that. This is the third time I've met Al since August, and the first time in the US. So we met in South America, and then we met in the UK, and now we're meeting here. We're often together on panels. For a corporate leader, Al has had more impact on engineering education than almost anyone I know. He chaired the task force of the group of STEM Connector, which I believe is 6,000 corporations, looking at the workforce of the future, talking about what do we know about how graduates perform after they leave, what needs to be changed in terms of going forward, and he has very important insights in that problem. And of course we have Ruth Graham, who really deserves some kind of a special medal for today. She flew in from the UK last night, and she's flying back to the UK this evening. May not be able to stay for the rest of our session this afternoon. Ruth, of course, is an international consultant. She's in high demand. Europe uses her all the time, particularly in the RAE, but also MIT has used a lot of her time. She is the author of the MIT report on the global state of the art of engineering education, which is one of our favorite books here at Olin. And she's also a consultant who has enormous insight into how education works in the classroom. I think this is because she's not, Ralph, close your ears, okay? She's not an MBA, she's a PhD in engineering. And one of the interesting things that we noted, her background is actually in aerostructures, I believe, which coincidentally happens to be my background. It was also Ed Crawley's background at MIT. So hint to the search committee, pay attention to people who have aerostructures backgrounds because apparently they build things that fly. So with that as a brief introduction, I'm going to ask Vin to take over and bring us through this session.
Well, thank you, Rick. And Rick actually has alluded to, I think, many of the themes that will come up in this conversation. The way we've structured this time together is that I'll first ask the panelists some questions specific to them and their sets of experiences and perspectives that will straddle the past, the current situation, and the future. And then I will ask them a common question of which you're not going to be surprised at the end, and see what their various responses are and the comments they may have about each other. But we want to leave enough time after those remarks for you, for our co-participants, to please join us in this conversation. To echo some things that Rick said, it's really a privilege for me to join these special colleagues and friends to what is, I think, an important conversation at this time in Olin. So, Ruth, I'd like to start with you, and as Rick just alluded to, one of our favorite publications is the Global State of Engineering Education report, sponsored by MIT, and that you conducted, and I think finally hit the public press about 18 months ago or so. So it's been about a year and a half of percolation. So what have you seen in the United States and throughout the world, the impact in engineering education of that report in particular?
Well, one of the things I've been very aware of over the last 5 years, perhaps, is that we've entered, I think, a period of quite fundamental and rapid change in higher education and in engineering education. I think perhaps actually less so in the US than in other parts of the world. And that's something that I mentioned in the MIT report, and actually it's something that I think has accelerated in the 18 months since that report came out. So the report, I think, landed on the desks of a lot of deans of engineering around the world at a very interesting time, and at a time of some very interesting conversations. And if I think about the conversations that I've had and the feedback that I've had on the report, I would say that the impact has perhaps been in two different types of institution. One type of institution where they were already thinking about change, they were already planning to make change. And I think the report gave them some real evidence and ammunition and information about making change. So identifying some of the challenges that they may encounter in the change process, highlighting examples of how other institutions have overcome those problems, some leverage for faculty who are perhaps concerned about the risks of making change, but also information for benchmarking. And if you look at, for most institutions that are making fundamental changes to their education, they start with a benchmarking process. And very often that's from a blank sheet of paper. And I think there are a lot of institutions and a lot of parts of the world where they don't have that global connectivity, particularly in the education sphere, that they don't have those people that they can call on, and areas of education where they really have that connection. And one critical piece of feedback, and this was one of my real drivers for wanting to do this work, is actually to provide people with that evidence, to give them that connectivity through the report so that they can look and see what best practice looks like, and they can start to make their own connections within that. And then the other type of institution that I think it's had an effect on, based on the feedback that I've had, is the more traditional engineering program, perhaps from a research-led institution who have a profile in research and who perhaps think, well, technically, we're at the top of our game. We get good students, so why on earth should we change? And I think perhaps a level of complacency, perhaps a curriculum that's changed very little in 30, 40 years, perhaps other than the introduction of maybe capstone projects and some team-based projects, but really a very teacher-centered approach, a very engineering science approach. And I think some of these institutions, the report has really started to open conversations perhaps for the first time. Conversations about to what extent are we really providing the best possible education for our students, and perhaps the even more uncomfortable question of to what extent will future prospective students believe that we're providing the best possible education for our students. So I think opening some of those conversations is certainly the feedback that I've been having to the report.
Well, thank you. There were many threads to the observations that you've made there, and hopefully we can come back and pick with some of them. Again, Rick anticipated a topic that I'd like to raise with Al. And as Rick pointed out, Al's really been a leader for more than a decade in industry academic collaborations, especially focused on STEM workforce development. And there have been other organizations, STEM Connector, besides STEM Connector, working in this area. Al, you've worked in these fields for a long time now. With a little bit of retrospection, what do you see as the accomplishments or things that you think have been achieved with these collaborations?
Yeah, thank you. And it's my honor to be part of this panel as well today, so thank you for inviting me. I do think a lot has changed in the last 10 years. I remember joining the first committees I was on and having discussions about if people knew what we meant when we said STEM. Because 10 years ago, the acronym was not as pervasive as it is. And today I drive around my neighborhood and I see signs for STEM middle school days. I mean, that's a massive transformation. It just didn't exist. But as was mentioned, I started getting deeply involved through co-chairing this STEM Innovation Task Force that was part of STEM Connector. It was a group of like-minded employers, all of whom saw a gap between what we perceived as our need for new young employees and what we were getting. And that costs us time and money as industry. Time and money until we make these people productive. So we studied what are the skills in the gap. We built a model about what those skills were. We started doing roundtables around the United States, bringing in experts, talking about what does it take to grow the digital fluency of students, the innovation skills of students, and also importantly, the professional and employability skills of young people. One thing I realized looking back is when I was younger, it was quite common that we, high school students, had part-time jobs. Very few high school students today have part-time jobs. And through those jobs we learned skills such as punctuality, reliability, trustworthiness, listening to directions, working together. School wasn't imparting these skills. And in fact, these were important skills, important skills for the workplace, important skills that students didn't have. So through our research, we found there was a common thread across these capability platforms, as we call them, and the common thread was experiential learning. And so we started as a group advocating for more experiential learning by doing, as was said in the previous discussion. Really critical, and here at Olin I found an environment where that was happening. So I do think the tide has changed in that regard. I also, though, think that challenges remain. I mean, there's a lot of fragmentation in the efforts. Industry is more involved than ever, but a lot of those efforts are highly fragmented still. We also initially focused on higher education. Most of us in industry, I think, focused on higher education initially, perceiving that as, quote, the issue. But in reality, our problem with the size and diversity of the STEM pipeline starts much, much younger. It starts in K through 12. It starts in the home. And so we've pivoted somewhat to, and industry has broadly been investing more, I think, in the K-12 space. I think that's a good thing. But we still have a long way to go, as was said, to transform education at all levels. Another area that we focus more in the last, say, 3 to 4 or 5 years is community and technical colleges. There are more students going to school there than there are in four-year institutions. They can serve many of the needs of employers if they get the right training. So industry engagement with educators, I think, is another critical theme that I'd say there's a lot more to be done. We need to make education more engaging for young people. We need to connect it to the real world. Programs like the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, these are things that students inherently care about. Sorry if you're teaching calculus, but they don't inherently care about calculus or chemistry, or very few students do. But when you wrap it around a problem, that's a problem that affects their world. And when you talk about the fact that these are the problems your generation needs to solve for our planet, That's highly motivating, I think. So moving education more in that direction is what needs to happen.
Thank you thanks very much. Again, Rick anticipated this. Lynn, of the dozens and dozens of things that you've done, including teach Design Nature about 2 hours ago at Olin, obviously one area that we all admire and look to was your contribution to making that external engagement part of Olin's mission a reality. I dare say with all my colleagues here in the room that there probably is no Olin faculty leader who has had more experience at Olin and elsewhere with this external engagement work. So again, in a retrospective sense, when you look at the things that you've been involved with and firsthand or observed, what are some of the lessons learned that you can pass to the next generation of people who are going to be beating the innovation and change drum?
Thank you. I think I'm glad you invited me to look back, because I've been thinking a lot about where we came from, not because I think we should be backward looking, but because I think it says a lot about where we're going. And it's 10 years this month since we launched the experiment that we now call the collaboratory, although I think it has a lot of other names and means a lot of things. But that really officially got started in October 2009. And I had an opportunity to read a document that we were using then to frame what it was we thought we were about. And it's really interesting because I think most of the things we said there are still the critical things today. So one piece of that was that it was very clear that this was not an initiative at Olin. It wasn't even an initiative of Olin. It was ultimately Olin as an initiative. And I think the seeds of that are in what we were trying to do 10 years ago, because we are a college, and we're also a cause. We're also a mission. We're also a catalyst. We're also a laboratory for the world. And what we did 10 years ago was we stopped focusing on making sure that we had the college up and running as our only purpose, but we didn't stop thinking about that. So 10 years ago, we knew that we existed to be a college and a catalyst, and those weren't two different things. Those were the same thing. And I think most of the lessons we've learned since then have been still struggling with that, still wrestling with that, thinking about what that enables us to do that nobody else can do. One of the things I've really learned as I work with other institutions, higher education, but anyone, is you gotta know why you're doing what you're doing. You gotta know what your passion is and what your purpose is. And we've been really fortunate at Olin to be, more so than most institutions, clear on that purpose, which isn't to say we don't have those moments when we sit back and say, wait, do we understand what we're doing? Why? But we really have, compared to almost any other place I've spent time, great clarity. So one of the things that we do when we work with other institutions is we try to identify what they think their purpose is. And I think you've both talked about some of the challenges that other institutions, both higher education and the whole K-12 system, STEM, have about not always being clear why they're doing what they're doing. Sometimes they're doing it because it's the way they've always done it, and maybe they started doing it for a good reason. At Olin, we ask a lot of the time why we're doing what we're doing. We ask maybe more than is healthy. There's those who have tried to help lead us may feel that, but we really do think that's an incredibly important question. And I think it's a question that in both of your domains you've found really powerful, and we've also found it really powerful with others. What is it you're about? What are you trying to accomplish? Forget what you're doing for a moment. Why? And when you step back from that, then you can start to ask questions about how. So a couple of comments about how. One is that we have learned, I think lots of people before us knew and helped us to learn, that learning is not a thing that somebody else can do for you. So there's this analogy about the coach of the soccer team going out and doing a whole bunch of push-ups. It doesn't make the soccer team any better, right? The coach can help the soccer team to get better, but the coach can't do the push-ups or the soccer drills or shoot the goals. And we, when we're teaching our students, we can do an awful lot to facilitate their learning, but we can't learn for them. And at a meta level, when we're working with other institutions, we believe we have some really important cultural markers that help us to do what we do. And I think you've both been trying to help institutions change their cultures and their assumptions and understand their passion and their purpose. And when we do that, we can't figure it out for them. We, Olin, if we are able to help catalyze change, are able to help catalyze change because we are able to help them figure it out for themselves. And I think that's the last lesson that we've learned, is that we do, I hope, have a great deal to contribute. There are things only we can do, and it will not be because we do it for others, but because we help facilitate their being able to do it for themselves.
Thanks so much. So much, Lynn. I'm glad this session is being recorded because I'm going to have to look at it and reflect on the wisdom that's being shared. Ruth, I'd like to connect something that Lynn just spoke about and the work that you've done, because besides that very public favorite report of ours, a few years ago you did a report for us where we were trying to assess for ourselves, as you've talked about often when you're to do your assessment first, assess for ourselves after we had done a fair bout of external engagement work, what had been our impact in that space. And it was a very informative report. I remember, for instance, one of the insights that I think you brought forward that we all then had to internalize was this idea of inspiring, in addition to working and doing co-creation. So I don't think there are very few people who are not Olin employees who know as much about Olin as you do. Given that, what do you see as the major contributions that Olin can make as we look forward?
Thank you. I think actually the combination of the MIT report and this internal report conducted on behalf of Olin, looking at Olin's external engagement strategy. I mean, a clear conclusion for me is that Olin is in an unrivaled position of leadership in engineering education globally. And that's not just clear to me, I think, from those two reports, but from all of my interactions. A couple of years ago, I did some work with Chile, looking at the massive amount of educational change that's going on there. And the name Olin came up over and over and over again. And that's pretty consistent in a lot of the work that I do. So I think Olin is in an amazing position. I mean, amazing particularly given you've only been in existence for 20 years. But I think there's a huge amount of potential there for the next 20 years to scale up that reach and impact that Olin has. And clearly there's the critical piece of your own education and continuing to innovate and push the boundaries and question and really experiment and continue to be a laboratory. But for me, looking at Olin, the largest potential that I can see is to expand in that external engagement space. And there are so many institutions, as I mentioned before, really looking to make quite fundamental change. And I think looking to Olin for that inspiration and really respecting Olin's voice. And Olin, I think, has an awful lot to give the community in terms of the what. What does world-class education look like? But I think there's even more that Olin could do in the future in terms of the how. And if you look at the MIT report, it identified a number of challenges that were faced by institutions across the world in terms of making educational change and delivering the best possible education. So these are challenges like, how do you scale up? How do you scale up from perhaps an Olin education to a very large and diverse student cohort? How do you make that work in practice? How do you work with faculty to change their mindset and to change their expectations of what it means to be an educator? How do you appropriately reward and recognise faculty for their contributions in education? These are all common challenges faced by institutions across the world. And I think there's a real opportunity for Olin to play a role in helping institutions and working with institutions to combat some of those issues and building strategic partnerships with universities that don't have the same institutional profile as Olin. And I think given the prominence of that Olin has in higher education and its ambition and its attitude of being a change agent, I think there's a huge opportunity there, for example, to look for global funding for a really bold and ambitious program to support educational change with partners, with other institutions across the world. And I really feel that Olin has a huge potential role to play in supporting a greater change in institutions around the world.
Thank you so much. Again, Al, I think I can connect these topics, and you used a word in one of your responses. I think you were talking about challenges, and you used the word fragmentation and one of the areas that I see, even though there is collaboration, one that is fragmented, is the industry-academic divide, as far as it being fragmented sectors, especially in engineering education, which does have this theory and practice associated with it, and we've seemed to have separated those domains. Again, with the work that you've been involved with, what do you see as the possibility or some ideas about fundamentally changing the industry academic relationships?
Yeah, I do think it has been changing, but I do think also it has further to go. I want to reflect just briefly on Lynn's comments and say that one of my favorite expressions in business, and I think it came from a Harvard Business Review case study, is what you measure is what you get. And measurements drive behavior. And I've worked with many other universities. Traditional ones are maybe the most challenging, public and private, and to talk to deans and professors and department chairs about changing the curriculum, teaching in different ways, is very challenging when the professors as a whole are more concerned about bringing in research dollars, moving their PhD students through the system, teaching their X hours required courses a day. So the system needs to expect something different from the faculty and the staff if we're going to make the systemic changes, I think, that are required. To your question, sorry,
No, that's relevant.
I think it's changing. A couple observations. First of all, I think for the most part, and it was great to get some prompts before this because it really made me think about this a little bit. Reflecting on industry engagement, and I think probably most of you see it as well, is there is generally industry engagement with most universities. It's mostly from larger corporations who maybe have the resources to devote to engaging with industry. And the reality is that there are more employees in small and medium business than in any area of our economy. So I think we need to look for ways to engage more small and medium business with universities, lower the barrier, if you will, whether it's financial, whether it's resources, whether it's reaching outbound to those organizations. So I think that's one big area that we need to think about together. I don't propose to have the answer, but I know the question we need to ask at least. Maybe that's a start. I think that's the most important start.
The hardest thing.
The other one is, and I know it's been done here and at other universities, but I think we need to do it more, and that is bring industry in as instructors, adjuncts and other mechanisms for bringing skilled people in. I've talked a lot to engineering schools about transforming their curriculum to focus more on the engineering process. But the reality in schools is that professors tend to be experts in specific disciplines. So I may teach design and you may teach structures, et cetera. But to understand manufacturability, for example, that's a subject that cuts across all of these areas. To understand sustainability in a holistic way, you need to think through the entire process from ideation all the way through disposal of a product. We don't generally in schools focus on subjects in that way from kind of an end-to-end process point of view. And I realize that too many professors in universities haven't worked in industry, don't have that perspective. And so I think that's an area that industry can absolutely help schools move forward, understand how we think about product ideation, design, development, manufacturing end to end, and bring that point of view more into the educational environment.
Thank you. In fact, anecdotally, we've had some experience at Olin where some of our faculty, during what we call a developmental leave, actually embedding themselves in industrial settings or in application settings that they wanted to become more familiar with. And it was transformational for them, for their career, and for their students. So that's really an important insight. Lynn, another topic that was drifting through these conversations was the shifting paradigms mindset of the students. Now Olin, we have the flags flying of Olin 2020 as we drive up come up the driveway. But from a demographic standpoint, from a societal standpoint, this is a different student population than the student population of 1999. And again, I know you as a faculty leader, as someone who's thought deeply about what that means. What are your insights as the type of things that we've got to think about as we think about curricular and learning for this and coming generations of students?
We've always at Olin been aware that our education, our experience was not a curricular one. It was a whole student, whole life. We are a residential college. And so I think being mindful of all of the aspects of the culture on our campus and how that influences and enables and empowers, or unfortunately sometimes limits or provides obstacles for our students' growth, and frankly, our own growth as faculty, as staff, as members of this community. I think we've tried to be a learning community for all of our members, and sometimes we've succeeded more than others. I think as time continues to change, those needs continue to change. And I said before, I think we're very good at asking, what are we about? And this is a moment when it really feels like the community on this campus is asking, what are we about? Why are we doing what we are doing? What is our intent? What is our purpose? And then, not that we're gonna throw away everything we've been doing, but that we're not gonna start from where we are. We're gonna start from where we aspire to be and use that as a lens to understand where we are. I think we're at a moment in the world where this question is being asked really broadly. You've alluded to some of the ways in which I think the question of why a university, what is a university for? And there are lots of things universities have been for over the ages, foremost among them preservation of knowledge. And I think we could argue, and as a computer scientist I feel compelled to argue, that maybe it's not all about preserving knowledge anymore. We might know how to do that. It's about a lot of other things, like what do we do with the knowledge and which knowledge, and how do we think? And I say that because I think the why of the university is being called into question in this moment more so than it ever has been. And as we start to dissect the many things the university has become, especially the U.S. modern, late 20th century research institution, not that that's the only organization out there, and sometimes we forget that in the US, forget the rest of the world, in the US, the majority of higher education is not that. So how do we understand what is the purpose of all of these institutions of higher education here and throughout the world? Similarly, what's the purpose of engineering? We've been good at asking that question on this campus. There are lots of partners out there who have also been asking those questions. There's a model of engineering that is, it's the thing that only the guru who sits atop the mountain knows. And I don't think that's the engineering we need today. Not that there isn't depth of expertise, but that we have this model that we go from things that are not technically complex to things that are technically complex, and then hope we can make some of them useful. What about a model of engineering where we start with things that are not very technically complex or useful, think about how to make them useful, and then add technical complexity as needed? Right? What about a model of engineering which is more connected to humanities? What about a model of engineering that's more connected to people? Some of these are things we've been saying for 20 years. Some of these are things other people have been saying for 20 years before that. So what is our purpose? And then we come back to what is the purpose of education? So at Olin, we're an undergraduate engineering education institution. So that question, what is the purpose of education, might have specific answers here. I think we're also a part of this much larger conversation. What is the purpose of education? Is it to create people who find purpose in their own lives? I mean, certainly I hope that's one of the things we contribute to. Is it to help people find jobs? Because as much as we could say, oh, it's all about these higher purposes, it's hard to be focused on those higher purposes if you're not gainfully employed, having things that you feel valued doing and you feel capable of doing. So all of these questions, we need to come back to what is our purpose, and then how do we build a community that helps each of its members to find that purpose, and in which we all help one another to grow.
Thank you, Lynn. And I think you can take many of the points that you've made and frame them as either a problem framework or, to be trite, an opportunity framework. It's the right time to be asking those fundamental questions, and both internally you feel it, but you feel the external forces doing exactly the same thing. So I'd like to bring the questioning together with a common question that I'd love you each to respond to in every way you see appropriate, and perhaps you can comment on each other's responses to this. Again, as Rick alluded to, as a group, but as also as individuals, you have contributed to Olin College's growth and progress over its 20 years, but specifically, I know, in giving advice to its inaugural and current president. So now we are in a situation where a yet-to-be-named individual will have to fill some very large and impressive shoes. And so I cannot think of a better group of folks to offer their insights and advice or their guidance to this yet-to-be-named person. So take that however you would like.
Thank you. So I think I would give a number of pieces of advice to the new president. I think the first might be, don't prejudge what Olin is. And I think Olin is a name that a lot of people know and talk about. And I think a lot of people have very fixed and clear attitudes to what they think Olin is and isn't, what it's good at and what it's bad at, and what it needs to improve at. And I think actually when you get to Olin and spend time with the people at Olin, I'm very aware that particularly this piece of work that I did with Olin a few years ago, and I interviewed a lot of faculty and a lot of staff and people from the institution, that it really changed my perspective about what makes Olin tick and what really works underneath the bonnet or the hood, depending on what side of the Atlantic you're on. So I think the first is don't prejudge what Olin is. I think the second is the community is absolutely critical. And I think unlike any other university that I've been involved with before, the community is just so central to who and what Olin is. And between the students, the staff, the faculty, the management, and all of the external players, the level of shared trust and shared passion and collegiality between all of those players, I feel has been absolutely critical to the experiment working and working together. And I think the new president needs to recognize that and lead from the top to make sure that culture continues. And the final piece of advice would be, don't be afraid to be bold. I had a conversation, I've had a number of conversations actually since Rick announced that he would be stepping down. A number of people have had conversations with me who are interested in applying for the role. And I had a conversation a few weeks ago with somebody whose concern was, Olin is at its peak, and surely as the next president, I can only fail. There's only one way, and that's down. And I think that will be a concern for anyone that comes in. And my advice would be, take advice, understand Olin, really work with the community, but don't be afraid to be bold. Olin needs to move on. If you see Olin as this delicate egg that can't be touched, that actually the college will slowly sink out of into obscurity, that actually you need to be bold and you need to be experimental and not be afraid to move the college to the next place.
Thank you. Lynn, Al, any words of wisdom?
I don't know if it's words of wisdom, but I'll try and make some comments. So first of all, I think that the students here have one of the greatest educational opportunities of any school I've been exposed to in the world, and I don't want to see that lost. So I think the new president needs to your point, keep innovating, keep moving forward. Lynn commented that students are different than they were 20 years ago. I think that's absolutely true. And the teachers / professors will be different in the next 10 years and 20 years, because just like we have students now that are digital natives, so-called digital natives, we're going to have professors that grew up in that time frame in just the next few years as digital natives. And I think they have a different view of what knowledge is, how to use the tools of the digital world, both in terms of learning and in terms of work. So I think that's something that we need to be acutely aware of and understand what type of changes that implies. Not because Lynn's on our panel. I think the externally facing mission of Olin is, I'm hesitating to say the most important, but such an incredibly important mission of the organization here globally. The influence, as has been mentioned, I mean, Olin gets referenced all over. In fact, I would love to see Olin be advocating not only in the domain of engineering education, but in other disciplines, because I think all of these points we're making don't only apply to engineering. Anyone studying any discipline needs to understand how what they're learning fits in the real world, how they make an impact as an individual with the skills that they're gaining. So I think a lot of the principles from here apply equally across a broad swath of disciplines in education and levels of education as well. I'm working with a New York City public school who I have a friend who is the school social worker there. I've worked with them for 15 years now. It's a middle school and high school. And although there were certain individuals who understood, I believe, what I was advocating for in terms of the importance of STEM education, making education more engaging, I'm really seeing a significant change now where educators are saying, help me find the materials to be able to start doing this. Help me find the references and the examples so I can start bringing this into my school. They weren't saying that 5 and 10 years ago, and I think here you have a base of experience that can help educators really at all levels. And the third thing I would ask is help us explore ways and find ways to blur the line even further between industry and academia. As we said earlier, and especially so that it impacts small and medium businesses. Because I think as I thought about this more, I realized there really is a bit of a dark area there where they're much less engaged, my perception, with academia, and yet they have the same needs, or their businesses won't stay at the leading edge, won't stay vital, won't stay economically healthy. So I think that's a challenge for all of us to think about how to make that happen.
Lynn?
There's a real temptation to say, listen to Ruth and Al. And I actually think that's my first piece of advice is we have some really good partners and friends, Ruth and Al absolutely, but others in this room. There are people here whose advice and whose wisdom have shaped who we are and continue to help us to see around the corners. And so really listening, really understanding what there is out in the world for us to learn from. We started with this Year of Invention 2000, where we actually went and visited lots of places, and then Sunlen Cho's recent, we miss him terribly, but he enabled us to go back out and start exploring again. And so we do need to keep listening. We need to not lose connection, and we need to listen internally and externally. So that's one big piece. And then I think to understand who we are, why we are, not to see internal and external as in opposition, but to understand that our purpose is the thing that both of those together enable. And that's really critical. It's so easy to think of the internal, the college, the thing we're doing here, and the external, the way we interact with the world. And there are lots of other institutions that potentially could do that. Could be a great institution of higher education and have a great outreach arm. That's not what we have ever been. And that brings me to the last piece, which is I think the next president of Olin will need to understand that we don't exist to do things other people do. We exist to do things only we can do, right? When, in their infinite wisdom, the F.W. Olin Foundation decided to start a college, it was not because the world needed another engineering school. Right? It was because the world needed a different engineering school. And so if we become the best of something that's already out there, we've lost our way. We're here to be different, not for the sake of being different, but because we were given this incredible gift to be able to do things that others could not. And all of the things that you've both talked about that are so important to our mission, to why we are, we need to really be brave. We need to embrace that, and we need a leader who will help us to do that, as we have had leadership to help us do that in the past.
Thank you. And for those of you who may not know, Lynn, among the many things she's doing, is the vice chair of our search committee. So it's important, to really gratifying to hear her perspective. I would hope that there are a lot of questions and comments out there for our panelists. So I'd like to open up the floor.
A bit of a question, a bit of a plea, and it's really kind of supporting your observation, Al, that to me, the great value of Olin is the model. And it is a changing model in that it is a laboratory, and the fact that all the students and the faculty are in fact lab rats, but they're also learning lab rats. And to get people to understand that's one of the most powerful ways to learn is something that is very, very valuable. And if you differentiate, and I look at that from the employment side, because Boston Scientific has been a hirer and a scope project supporter since the beginning. And Olin graduates are better dot collectors than others. And dot connectors are very valuable in life, and it's something that academia in general doesn't do. You're rewarded for building silos and taller and thicker walls, and therefore it's kind of bucking this trend. And I think, I've sort of learned because of the collaboration experiences to date that what makes it very, very difficult is you're bucking the culture and of these institutions. And you may get it within a department, but boy, if the whole school is on the silo route, then they're going to say, well, that's less valuable. I was always struck in MIT where they developed the HST program with bioengineering. The people leading that program were viewed at a lower level than everybody else because they were teaching a hyphenated product. And that, to me, is is that unique Olin model. And how you represent it and get it beyond is something that I think has already been great, but it's going to take a lot longer than we thought. So just compliments. And you're right. The next stage is going to be tricky and going to take different programs, but never stop building the plane as you're flying it.
Any comments from the panelists on John's observations?
Only to say thank you for that and many other things, and to underscore, as you've suggested, that perhaps one more piece of advice for the next president is patience, that this is a long game, and we're trying to find ways in which we can make shorter term, more visible changes, and the big play is the long play. So thank you for reminding us of that.
I'm not sure if this is so much of a question as it is a sort of a life's dilemma for me, and I want to share it and ask you to kind of enter into it with me. Myself, and this is not necessarily about Olin, but about the engineering and as an enterprise, its impact on the world that we live in, a technologically infused world. And engineering has a huge impact on what happens and what doesn't happen. And I've been thinking about the fact that most of our science was derived and based on the world as a simple system. And we don't live in that world anymore, that we live in a dynamically complex world that and those things don't necessarily translate over here. And like Al says, we don't actually, in my mind, have the economies, the goods and services that we need to thrive on the planet together. That there's legacy industries, but we haven't yet conceived of and grown the things that we need. And I'm sort of sitting here with all those dilemmas. Do they look the same to you, or how does it look to you all? Does that sound like a question?
Well, I think that's the power of institutions like Olin, that they're not training students with a certain skill set and with a certain career trajectory in mind, that actually it's creating problem solvers and people who ask questions and explore and know where to identify the evidence and information they need to solve the problem that's in front of them. And I think that needs to be the way that engineering education is going. And to me, that Olin being able to continue to adapt to that and adapt to those kind of challenges that students will face, and knowing that we don't know what their careers are going to look like, I think is one critical piece of why the Olin type of education is the future for engineering education, because it gives students that flexibility, but that ability to build their own skill set and their own knowledge set, and to continue learning beyond graduation, that there isn't an end point there.
Question here.
So I just first wanted to thank you guys for sharing such wonderful insights about kind of the future of Olin and everything. And one thing that I wanted to kind of follow up on was building off of Lynn's questions. So we've heard a lot about today about what is to be gained by the incorporation of industry into education. And one question that I have is what elements of schools kind of is derived from the independence from industry, and in essence, kind of which elements should we be careful to preserve as we incorporate the really important needs of industry into our educational systems?
Yeah, I can try and make a few comments to start. I do think you have certain freedoms here in an educational environment that we don't have in industry, definitely. And in fact, we often in industry look to universities, colleges, et cetera, research institutions specifically for that purpose. We don't have the luxury to often devote time and effort to a completely different way of approaching a problem, for example. So I think that's something unique that schools can bring to the table and should absolutely continue to. Another thing, and in a way it touches back on the comment here as well, I think, is that I'd like to see us think about ways to engage you, the students, more, or the students broadly more, in the outreach that we're talking about, not only to industry, but to other schools. Now, I know Olin students I've spoken to may not have enough time in the day to do that, so maybe that's a challenge for the new leadership, is to figure out how to do that. But one of our big challenges in technical fields broadly, the STEM fields, is the size and diversity, especially of the students who are participating. And I work, as I said, in the South Bronx with this middle school and high school, but unfortunately, I don't look like them. I didn't grow up there. There's a very different exchange that happens when I bring in a young person who came from their community, who literally speaks their language, because most of them natively spoke Spanish. And I've brought in a Spanish woman, technical executive, and she flips to their native language, and the engagement is incredible. Or I brought in a group that was hosting the Black College Expo, which was being held in Brooklyn at Medgar Evers, and there's just a whole different dynamic. So how do we harness, I think maybe to your point, how do we harness that as a way to energize the next generation and the one beyond that? So sorry, I veered off a little, but I wanted to make that comment related to this as well. I'll just mention, we're running, I'll call it an experiment. We have a North American rocketry competition sponsored by a not-for-profit in Southern California called the Base 11 Space Challenge. There, we had hoped to get 12 teams across the United States and Canada. We got 32 teams. There's now 24 remaining for various reasons. Couldn't raise funds, couldn't get the right insurance. One of the requirements they have, in addition to judging their engineering work, is they have to put together a marketing campaign to talk about what they're doing in their communities, in their locale, and they have to have an outreach plan to at least one community college and one high school. So we've got the students, if you will, I hope, doing our bidding. And so it's not me going to those community colleges and high schools, it's 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are going there saying, look at this cool work we're doing, look at this exciting stuff. Time will tell, but we're hoping that we'll be able to energize kind of a layer of student interest that we never did before. So I think, how do we bring maybe the students more into the equation is another thing for us to think about as we think forward.
The other day in Boulder, Colorado, I was sitting in the waiting room of a doctor's office, and a mother came in with a 19-month-old kid, boy, and they sat down, and the little boy reached into his mother's pocketbook and got out her cell phone and started fiddling around with it. And then the mother looked down and said, "How did you do that?" And then the 19-month-old was beginning to teach his mother, how that was done. Anecdote one. In Boulder, Colorado, we have the Boulder Mall, and often when I go down there, I see 4 teenagers walking side by side, humans, and every single one of them are on this thing, and they're spending, kids are spending 6 to 7 hours a day on this. And third anecdote is that my computer educators are my grandkids, aged 14 to 22. And Harari, who wrote the book Sapiens, also has written a book called Homo Deus. I don't know whether you've read it or not. But in it, he basically projects that we are all, as human beings, with the advent of AI and AGI, becoming algorithms, and that being alive will be being programmed someplace in the future. How are all those, this so rapidly changing world, how are those being incorporated? How can we incorporate those concepts into this idea of education? I project that probably 95% of people in the C-suite have no idea what big data is all about. And probably a lot of people in middle management as well. So when younger generations will be better prepared to change older generations, and this leads to the concept of lifelong learning. But I wonder if any of you would like to respond to how all of those factors are going to impact on what Olin College is going to be able to contribute in the future.
So I'm happy to take that on. I don't know whether you'll find my answer satisfactory. For those of us who were born in the last millennium, we are living in the future, right? The world that I live in today is not the world that I knew as a young adult, let alone as a child, let alone what my parents or my grandparents lived in. And the world in 10 years is likely to be different in more ways than I can predict. The rate is changing. And we also know that even as things change, we are fundamentally the same. It turns out that this is not a relationship, which is not to say that this can't mediate a relationship. And I will tell you that my adult children have relationships that are really deep, intense, and meaningful with people who they've only encountered on the other side of the phone. So don't get me wrong, these can be really important. Sorry, this is meant to be my phone. But we are fundamentally relational beings, and we have, and I say this as someone who studies cognitive science and artificial intelligence, we have always used our most advanced technologies to understand ourselves. So first, we were machines, we were clockwork, we're computers, now we're internet digital beings. We are still the same as we were when we were in caves, with much more sophisticated ways of doing things, including relating to one another. So how do those come together? Well, we're also, Olin, a community of learners. And I learn more from my students than they learn from me. It's just that we learn different things. We learn together, right? And so I don't know how we're going to change how we educate at Olin because of the ways in which our students have changed in all the ways we talked about it, including these. I do know that we here believe that there's some real benefit to looking into each other's eyes and to doing things together. And so we're not quickly going to give that up. And we'd love to learn together with our students all the ways in which we can augment that really important thing that we're currently doing, because it comes back to, why are we doing what we're doing? Well, we're doing it to enable us all to do more, better, more meaningfully.
Thank you, Lynn. Any final questions? Well, with that, I want to thank my three colleagues on this panel. I've certainly learned a lot, and as I said, I'm going to be reviewing the tape. For those of you who don't know, we have a screen here in front of us that's projecting time, not only here, but in London. So Ruth is looking at it saying, it's late. So thank you all for coming in your own way, such unique contributions to Olin. But of course, Ruth, we're going to give you the Distance Award for doing that. But thank you very much. And
Okay, it's about time to reconvene for our last session. It's good to see there are still some people here. I have just some reflections on 20 years of being at Olin, and I have had almost no time to prepare it. It's been a busy last couple of weeks, as you might guess. A few things that were not planned have come up. And I'm standing between you and food, which is always a bad thing to do. So I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can to make it as painless as I can for people in the audience. What I'm going to talk about is three things, okay, sort of three phases of what's happened from my seat at Olin. The first one is starting things from a blank sheet. This has been recognized as the way you correct the problems in the traditional universities that don't change. It's easy. Let's just start from a blank sheet. Well, let's have a talk about that. Okay, what can go wrong with starting with a blank sheet? Turns out we've been visited by hundreds of universities, 2 of them in the last 2 weeks, who want to start new universities, one in England and one in Brazil. And they're convinced that starting with a blank sheet will just make all the problems go away. The second is about observations on global education and change. What's happening around the world? It's not just the US, it's not just Olin. There are some important things happening that will affect Olin as well. And the third one is a vision for the future. What needs to happen and who's going to do it? So let me start out with starting from a blank sheet. So first of all, I have to respond at least a little to Larry in his comments, which I felt were overgenerous. He painted this picture that it wasn't long after I showed up that everybody was convinced they had the right decision and, you know, I was just the right person. I have a slightly different recollection of that. It was a little more of a struggle. I understand how fortunate I was to be selected. It was a long time ago. I was in my 40s. I had not built any colleges that I could remember. I had not worked with the Board of Trustees. Larry and the board taught me a great deal in those first couple of years, and there's their great patience and persistence, which allowed me to succeed, and I'm going to talk about that. It's something my dad taught me long ago, and that's it's always better to be lucky than smart, and being in the right place at the right time is exactly why I'm here, okay? The other thing that I learned about starting new institutions, it's all about people. It's really not about buildings and endowments and curricula. You need those. They don't matter if you have the wrong people. If you have the right people, those don't matter so much. It's about getting the right people. And if you're the first one, the only way you do that is to make sure that every person you hire is better than you are. And since I'm the first person, you know what that means. So that has been a really important principle. The bottom line is gratitude, authentic gratitude, is the foundation for enduring success. And I've seen that everywhere. People who don't have enduring gratitude don't often last. And when you're looking at candidates for the next president, if there isn't some theme of being grateful about what happened in their career as they came up, I would be a little worried. Next, leadership. Learned a lot about leadership here. Never been to Babson. I didn't take a course at Harvard on how to be a leader. I just jumped in the deep end and started moving my arms. So what did I figure out? Leadership is not about power. Leadership is about responsibility. And that's another filter I would be using as I'm looking at candidates. If you think that the person is anxious to do this because they're anxious to have the power and the authority to make things happen, good luck with that, okay? Leaders who really succeed are those who take responsibility for what happens and are more nervous about the responsibility and what it means because they're the one who's responsible for everyone else. Olin's mission to start from a blank sheet and to reinvent engineering education doesn't happen once in a lifetime. It happens much less frequently than that. This is a huge responsibility. And in fact, as I looked at it, this is way too big of a responsibility for any one person to imagine that they could sit down and invent the right answers and put them on the wall and everybody should look at it. This is way bigger than that. So for me, the answer was the President's Council. It's the group that's here now. This has lasted for a long time. So the first thing that I did was reach out to the smartest people I know and ask them to help me. Turns out it's not that hard to do. If you go to people, really smart people, and say, I have this bizarre opportunity to start with a blank sheet, to rethink engineering education, and we have money enough to build buildings and to bring students here. If you could change one or two things about engineering, what would it be? You know, I have not found a person who doesn't have an opinion on that. And all I need to say was, we need your help. Come and join us. We're meeting twice a year. We're going to ask you questions, and your opinion matters. And you can build a President's Council, but it's about advice, because it's too much. It's ridiculous to think that one person is going to have all the wisdom you need to make it work. So the process, actually, is if you could start a school anywhere, and you needed, with high expectations to be successful coming right out of the starting gate, it's about people. So where do you put it? You put it where the people are, okay? If Olin were located in Siberia, by the way, I was on a panel for the World Bank, helping them to advise Kazakhstan on where they should build their world-class university. It's pretty close to Siberia, it turns out. Attracting the right people is a really important thing. By the way, Boston, this greater Boston community, is in essence the Silicon Valley of higher ed. The people you want are here. Many of them are in this auditorium. So that's a really important thing. And the process actually works like this. You start with a compelling need. The people you want are not looking for a job. They might need a mission. They might need a cause, something that's worthy of the rest of their life. So if you can articulate a cause that's worthy of someone changing their career at Harvard, then you have a chance to attract the right people. It starts with a compelling need. The compelling need attracts the right people develop the right ideas. With the right culture and process, those ideas with experimentation become how to do it in policies and procedures, and it works in that order. If you get them backwards, things don't work so well. By the way, just in case bureaucracy is a really bad idea, okay? That starts with the how to do it that you borrowed from traditional institutions, and then you're trying to apply it to the blank sheet that's trying to do things in a new way. I understand how that works. In fact, I can give you lots of examples. I'll just mention one. When I was in Iowa City, Iowa, as the Dean of Engineering at the University of Iowa, my next door neighbor, Julius Schmidt, was an artist. In fact, he was a sculptor, and he worked in the art school. And I was complaining to him that the operations manual at the University of Iowa had a risk management chapter that said, once upon a time, a student in the engineering school went to the shop, and they turned on the milling machine, and they got hurt. So the Board of Regents said, that shall never happen again at the University of Iowa, and they put a lock on the door, and only licensed machinists who are members of the union can ever touch the shop. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to get kids to really learn how to be engineers now. He said, really? That's really strange. Because in the art school, we have kids that are smelting metal at 3,000 degrees, and there's no safety requirements whatsoever. They don't know anything about metal. It just works. So when we came to Olin, we don't have a rule that says students can't work in the shop. Okay, now we haven't had an accident yet, so that might change. We'll see. Just in case bureaucracy. Be careful of that. As I said before, it's not about one person's idea. So when I was recruited to Olin and went to Larry's place, and we talked about this for a long time, I was so impressed with what he had to say not expecting really to be seriously interested in this, but Larry changed my mind. On the plane on the way home, I wrote a letter, like 5 pages, I think. If you're really going to spend that much money to start over, here's some things you should think about. We called it the white paper, okay? Larry liked it. I think he then asked other candidates to do something similar. When I was recruited, it became the shared vision for what Olin could be. My first job, recruit like 5 vice presidents and get them here, before Christmas. This was the idea. Okay, what about the curriculum? Maybe what I should do is to take this white paper and put it on the bulletin board and tell everybody when they come, that's what we're going to do. See, we've all agreed on it. I think this is a good idea. So does the board chair. And then had this knot in my stomach. There's something wrong with that. Remember that point about no one person is smart enough to know exactly what to do? So I put it in a drawer, and I didn't show it to anybody. Sometimes I threatened to show that to some people, but I asked our team to invent better ideas than that. And then they will own it as well. It'll be their vision, not my vision. The people that you want in a school that does this kind of innovation don't take orders very well. If they do, they're the wrong people, okay? So that started our culture off in a particular direction, which led to experimentation. Olin's fundamental advice to everyone that comes is experiment. Try it. This is not hard. Again, I came from a farm, so none of my family are engineers. And so I have some pretty basic ideas. One of those ideas, which is really simple, is it's amazing what you can see by looking, okay? This is from one of our great philosophers who was a baseball player, right? Yogi Berra. If you actually try it, if you pull the wings off of higher ed in a lab and see what happens, you'll be amazed at what you see. And I don't think Olin would have succeeded at developing the culture we have any other way than by what happened with the Olin Partner Year. Because the experiments that we did and the results that we saw were completely non-intuitive. Everyone said this couldn't happen, and it kept happening. If we had read it in a paper at a conference, we'd have said, yeah, something wrong with that experiment. Nobody could duplicate it. But because we did it over and over and over for the same year with the kids we knew, we had to admit there's another way, okay? There's something better that can be done than what we're doing now. So I guess we don't have a choice, but we have to step out on the ice and try to make this work. Experiment, experiment, experiment. Then there's later on, watching the kids walk across the stage at commencement. Several years in a row, became clear that there's something different about these graduates. This is not my first university. This is my 4th one. I've watched them graduate at the University of California. I've watched them graduate at USC in Los Angeles. I watched them graduate in the Big Ten at the University of Iowa. Lots and lots of them. These kids were different. And then I talked to the parents. And what I realized is they have had here what I would call a life transformative education. You can't really see it unless you're a parent. But the kids who came in first year are different than the kids who left. And I don't mean just because they know how to integrate by parts now in calculus. They're different people. Their identity has changed. They came in, as some parents said, relatively fragile, but they left with a mission that the parents felt was protective. They didn't have to worry about them now in the world. These kids were going to be on the TED stage telling everyone else how to run the world. What a gift. How important is that? So, if that's what we do, it's transformative education, the question, which is, I would say, every 30 seconds in the boardroom for 20 years, how do you scale this? Okay? Do you write a book? Do you create a video? Do you replicate the college, a bunch of the little Olins all over the world? Do we create little toolkits that we send out, Olin in a box? How do you do this? This is about replication and growth, right? I've had a lot of time to worry about that because I can never satisfy the board in that area. I don't think my successor will either. Why does it not work that way? Every time I talk to the faculty about writing a book that will change the world, and some of us have, writing a book is not a bad idea, but it doesn't change the world. Why does it not work? I think what's wrong with education is more like what's wrong with a broken marriage. It's not because we miss a toolkit. It's not because we need to watch a video to get the how to do it. It's deeper than that. It's relational. It's identity. There isn't a quick fix, okay? I'm sorry, at least I haven't found it. It's like curing cancer. You have to do this in a way that matters, in a way that works. We're still working on it. The best I can say about a way that changes is how Olin has changed the reputation and the vision for engineering around the world. Isn't it amazing? When I came here 20 years ago and sat in a closet, basically, in Nichols Hall at Babson, we rented an email server at the University of Iowa because I knew the IT guy really well there. Doug Eltoft's a great friend. We paid him $1,000 a month, and they ran all of the email for Olin, okay, through them. My biggest job was telling people that Olin existed, number one. And then those people said, oh, Olin. It's like, Oberlin? No, it's Olin. And then, well, wait a minute. Isn't there an Olin at Babson? Oh, I get it. You're the engineering school at Babson because there's an Olin School of Business at Babson, right? No, it's not Babson. So for at least 5 years, the job was trying to get on the radar that we exist. We're a college. We're not like an independent college. We're not part of a university somewhere. We're trying to do this experiment, and so on and so on. A lot of that kind of work. And now, 20 years later, we have Ruth Graham telling us that everybody is looking at Olin as a model. So how did that happen? If we set out on day one to do that, what did we do? I think the answer is given to us by Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller was an architect. He's the guy who invented the geodesic dome. What did he say? Fuller said this: to create fundamental change, don't bother trying to explain why it's needed, just make a new model that makes the others obsolete, okay? And that's what Olin did. We haven't spent a nickel on marketing Olin to people around the world. They found us and they showed up. And now MIT is involved in the NEAT program, which Ed Crawley in this very auditorium said a little over a year ago, they're Olinizing the MIT curriculum. Okay, we could not have engineered that by selling a book or by writing a video. We had to build a model that you can't get away from by looking at it. It works. Okay, and by the way, when Olin affects change, they don't copy what we do. Copying what we do, except for the experimentation idea, is not the right approach. I'm not sure what Olin does is the right thing. We talk about this a lot. The average kid at Olin completes 25 to 35 design build projects. Many of them have started and run a business. We have this candidates weekend thing where they all go through 2 days of building stuff in the auditorium before they get invited. Now, talk to the University of Michigan about that. You want to be like Olin? Got to do this. No, you don't. I think we overdo it because we can. It's the culture. Do you really need 25 to 35 design build projects? I don't think so. I think Ed Crawley probably has it close to right at MIT. Their plan is to do about 5, okay? That's 20% of the investment in the curricular change. I'm going to bet they'll get 80% of the benefit, okay? I can't prove it. I think that's the calculation they're making too. It's adapt the Olin principles. It's not duplicate. And that's all you need to change the way people think. One last thing about starting from a blank sheet is about governance. Olin would not be where it is if we haven't had a governance board that has been more than tolerant in the last 20 years. I've seen a lot of this. I've been on the board for several colleges, not just Babson. I'm on the board now for Indian Institute of Technology in Gandhinagar. I've been on the board for Kustar, the Khalifa University of Science, Technology, and Research in Abu Dhabi. Dozens, in fact, 15 countries, more than 100 keynote speeches. There's 2 universities just in the last few weeks that are asking for the same thing. So I've watched governance around the country. The key to this, to harness the real creativity and the experimentation in higher ed is the faculty. And it's not rocket science, but people don't do it very well. There's a book by Henry Rosofsky. I don't know if you know who Henry is. He was dean of faculty at Harvard for about a zillion years. I think he was president for a while. And he's written a book about the operation manual for a university. How does it work? The key he points out, if you look at the Times Higher Education ranking of universities globally, you'll find that of the top 25, 3/4 of them are in the US or in the UK. If you look at the top 100, it's about 3/4 as well. So what is this? Is it because America is wealthy or, actually, no. In his view, it's quite simple. It's about governance that recognizes academic freedom and shared governance with the faculty. This doesn't happen in other countries, okay? I can tell you, I was working with the World Bank to advise Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, about building a new university there in Astana. You know what their board of trustees is? Or at least as it was when they started? 30 people. Do you know who the chairman of the board is? Nazarbayev, okay? The other 29 are ministers in the government that report to Nazarbayev. Nobody from the academic world. I was asked to be the first trustee from not in that group, and my wife was not fond of the idea of me flying to Kazakhstan every few months. We didn't do that. Academic freedom means you can't predict what the faculty will do. You can't predict the outcome of an experiment before you do it, else it's not an experiment, okay? It's a development project. That's the real fuel that's allowed our faculty to move forward. So I'm hoping everybody realizes that it's really inconvenient in the boardroom if you can't tell you what the achievements are going to be in a couple of months or 3 years or what the budget will be. I know it's inconvenient. Live with it. If you don't, you can predict everything. You can predict that nothing will happen here that's of any interest. So it's a trade-off. Innovation really begins by learning to improvise and by doing experiment. Really, really important lesson, both for the board and for the president. If you're going to create this culture that enables experimentation, there has to be a really strong belief, commitment, and understanding that underlying all of this is a kind of kindness, a kind of automatic forgiveness for not meeting expectations. One of our new faculty members explained this in a very brilliant letter to our Board of Trustees last fall about this time. The idea is forgiveness enables experimentation. Obsession with failure or cost prevents experimentation. Okay, if I'm going to get punished for trying new stuff, great. I can make sure I just keep my head out of that space and you will get exactly what you asked for. Predictability, okay? Which is what happens in all the other universities where I've been. By the way, all of this has enabled the ability for the board to be patient and to indulge a president who's doing a tap dance when he's trying to tell you what we're going to be doing 3 years from now, because he has to keep looking in the faculty room to see what they're doing so we can predict that. Is trust. You have to have an enormous amount of trust between the president and the board chair. You should not be able to put a knife blade between the president and the board chair on any important decision that happens in the college. If you can, you're on the way down. It's only a matter of time. How do you get trust? By the way, trust, like respect, is not something you can give. It's something you have to earn. Both ways. The president has to earn the trust of the board, and the board has to earn the trust of the president, or you wind up protecting yourself. And when that happens, you can put a lot more than a knife blade between people. So trust is fundamental. What makes Olin work in the culture, everybody here knows, is teamwork. By the way, the foundation for teamwork is very simple. It's a rule that we call no surprises. If you're on the team, you don't find out what we're going to do by reading it in the newspaper 3 weeks later. Oh, that's what they're going to do. Apparently, I'm not on the team because they didn't even talk to me about it. Think about it. Even at a place as small as Olin, you have like 150 employees, teamwork with no surprises means it takes time to reach a decision. You can't just say, well, I'll answer you by 4 o'clock this afternoon if you're going to have to consult with 150 people. So get used to the fact that the pace of decision-making in a team-driven environment is slower than the pace of decision-making in a top-down autocratic institution, which may be what people are more used to. And of course, Olin is an institution on steroids when it comes to teamwork, so we really have trouble with doing things quickly. Last thing, which I think is very simple about this starting from a blank sheet thing, is really, again, I said I'm from a farm, right? So most of what I know you can put on a fortune cookie. This thing says, simply, you can only teach what you know, and you can only govern what you've experienced. So if you're a teacher here, and you're supposed to teach teamwork, and you're supposed to teach people how to engineer, good luck with that if you've never engineered anything and you've never worked on a team. If you're constantly going back to the recipe book and saying, well, I have to spend so many minutes saying that, but you've never actually experienced it, it's obvious to the people who are in the class. You need to experience it. And if you're on the governance board for a college, particularly one that does a lot of experimentation, it's going to mean that you need to have experienced some of this, and you need to be patient if you haven't. It's very hard to find people who've been through Olin who are ready to be a trustee, so you have to borrow principles and ideas from your experience elsewhere. Okay, so starting from a blank sheet works. Olin is an example. It also has a lot of pitfalls. A lot of things can go wrong. Most startup businesses fail. That's pretty obvious. Most startup businesses fail too. Olin is very fortunate. I couldn't be more grateful for the indulgence and the trust and the support that we've had from the board and from everybody in this room. Olin is an exception, and I'm absolutely thrilled. Now, observations about what's happening elsewhere. I've been a lot of places, it turns out. As you mentioned, the board has also asked good questions about that. Why are you getting on a plane going to X and Y? So just an example of the places that I've been that I can just remember off the top of my head, in every case giving a talk or being on a board. India, Brazil, Abu Dhabi, England, or the UK, Singapore, China, South Korea, Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, Russia, Mexico, Denmark, Colombia, Costa Rica, and I'm sure there are others I just don't remember. But you can't do this without learning something. Let me just give you one illustration. In April, for the first time, I went to Denmark. Never been there. Usually, by the way, when we have really cool places to go, I give that to somebody else on the team because that's kind of, they can bring their wife, it's a good place. So that nobody wants to go to Kazakhstan. But this time, I went to Denmark, all right? It was like ridiculous. I think I set the Guinness Book of World Records because I was back on the ground in Boston in 24 hours. So you had to go there, and it was 100 miles from Copenhagen, and then get back, and then fly, and then had to be at Harvard the next day. The thing that sticks in my mind, this was a meeting of 250 people that were all ministers of higher education and science in the country of Denmark, and it was convened by the cabinet minister for higher education and science. His name is Tommy Ehlers, and he's an entrepreneur. So I'm the first thing on the agenda because I have to catch a plane, but we didn't start with any speeches. I stood on the stage, and you know what they did? They had a piano there, and they all sang a song. Everybody sang this song. It lasted for at least 5 minutes. Okay, it's in Danish. What are they saying? So I asked the woman next to me, you know, what are the words to this song? And why are you doing this? And she says, this is Denmark. We all do this. Denmark has the highest percentage of daycare for people, independently of the family resources. They all send their kids to daycare of any place in the country. And we all learned these songs when we were little kids. So I got the words to this song. It just says so much about the culture. I don't remember the words exactly, but they start off with a verse that says, look at this person walking down the street, looking at their shoes, looking depressed, unhappy, and then it goes into the chorus. Look at the sky. You know, imagine the horizon, how the world could be differently if we just spent more time helping each other. Then there's the next verse, and it just goes through this, all about how the world could be better if we work as a group. And you know what I thought at that time? Can you imagine if the US Congress started with singing a song? Look at what they achieve in Denmark. Okay, if you do that for 15 countries, you begin to get some feeling for what education plays in this society and how it matters. And you know, I've done a lot of work with the Grand Challenges and with the National Academy of Engineering's Grand Challenge Scholars Program. There are 4 major areas, like, for example, sustainability. I mean, it's a word that's pretty common at Olin. It's not the only one, though, folks. There's also security, which is an issue, global health, and enhancing life in an age of increasing population on a fixed planet. But you know what? The underlying, what I would call the mother of all grand challenges is education. Why? You can't you can't solve any of those other challenges without education, and educating in a new way, because it's a different kind of problem than we've attacked before. And secondly, education is the answer to a lot of the problems. For example, from the World Bank, the birth rate in Brazil in 1960, live births per woman is about 7.0. The birth rate in Brazil in about 2010, about 2 births per woman. Whoa, what happened there? According to the studies the World Bank gave, education for women has a transformative effect on birth rates in societies. So rather than building a widget for our iPhone and giving it to everybody so that they can, you know, reduce the percentage of carbon that they're putting in the atmosphere today, why don't we talk about educating the young women in society everywhere? And that might, in fact, reduce the pressure on the grand challenges from the beginning. That's an interesting outcome that we don't talk about in engineering very much, because we make things happen by building stuff. By the way, if you look at the World Bank's view of what's happening globally in education, they point out that the BRIC countries, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, have a rising middle class for the first time. What's the most important need of the rising middle class? Turns out it's education for their children. In all of those countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, there's a mad commitment to building universities faster than you can imagine. It's just ridiculous. In India, for example, in the last 5 years, they built about 3,000 engineering schools. Now think about that. What does it take to make a college or a university? Does it take buildings? It takes people. I guess there were gazillions of PhDs in engineering working at Starbucks, just waiting for these colleges to start, right? So they could have a place to work. It's people, okay? They're having a real problem with that. Russia, there's Putin's 5/100 2020 project. This is how the new Skoltech at MIT has been involved in, how it came into being because of Putin's concern about that. There's China, you know, which is building so many universities, about a UCLA-sized university every 90 days. They've been doing this for decades. There's 10 of them under construction in the Shenzhen, Dongguan area right now, because I just saw them when I was there in December. Lots is happening. But you know what? When then you compare what you see elsewhere and the passion that they have for making it happen, and education is the answer, and then look at what we're doing in the US. Okay, by the way, one of the striking things, the US is one of the only, maybe the only developed country on the planet that doesn't provide a BS level education for everyone. You know, we expect parents to pay for that. And now that the 2008 financial crisis is over, the states don't even subsidize it. That's why the tuition is going through the ceiling. How does this match up? By the way, those other countries like India have found a way to pay for a lot of it. There's also AI. So that's our big invention. AI, this is going to save everything. We'll just send everybody on a software program that will teach them how to be brilliant, okay? In fact, it'll know more than you do. So you just have to sit down, it recognizes who you are, it'll tell you a story, and it will see that you're doing things really well. How well is that going, okay? I'd suggest that you take a look at an article in the Atlantic magazine in August of this year. It's co-authored by Henry Kissinger and by Dan Huttenlocher, who's the new dean of the Schwarzman College of Computing at MIT, looking at AI. They have a slightly more troubled view of what AI is going to do. Don't think it's the answer to everything. It's a tool. It's not the answer. The problem with AI, very simply, it can solve complicated problems that we don't have any equations for It has no explanation. It has no reason why this happens. It just knows if you watch this enough, this is what happens. There you go. There's your answer. Okay, that's not what it means to understand anything. To understand something means to make sense of it. And if it doesn't tell you how to make sense of it, it just enslaves you. Now what happens is you have to be extremely careful what you ask it to do, because it'll do exactly what you ask it to do, and the consequences of that will be disastrous. It has no wisdom, because it has no theory behind what's happening. Kind of an issue to worry about. So as we've been thinking about this at Olin, we've also discovered kids are different today than they were 20 years ago. 2 years ago, this month, 2017, New York Times runs an article, there's an unprecedented epidemic of anxiety disorders among teenagers in America today. A month or two later, there's a spike in teenage suicides in America that's linked to the amount of time they spend in social media. Then, in January of 2018, Tim Cook is on live TV asking parents not to let their kids use their iPhone with software. Maybe there's something we don't understand about this that we need to look into. Mindset is really important. So the AI project, using AI to train people, works pretty well. It does not educate people because they don't make sense of things. Educating people has deeper roots than that. It's like the problem that we were talking about with education, being closer to what's wrong in a broken marriage than to you need a tool for your toolbox. How to fix it? Mindset, it turns out, is something that's deeply of interest in psychology today and has a profound interest on the long-term outcomes for kids in their career. Here's the key. Very simple, back to the farm again. What's the takeaway message? Turns out, hopeful faculty members spread hope among their students. And cynical faculty members spread cynicism. You never met a cynical faculty member, have you? I did when I was a student. Luckily, I had one who was hopeful. And you all know him. He was Mel Ramey. He was my mentor who passed away from brain cancer about 2 years ago. Mel changed everything in my life because he helped build a growth mindset. Every time you walk into the classroom and you pick up a piece of chalk, you're not just teaching calculus, you're shaping a mindset. Whether you realize it or not, you're having an impact on that class. Somebody in that class has a broken heart, okay? And you better pay attention to that. And you're seeing what happens if you don't pay enough attention to it in what's going on at the school now. We need to be more tuned to what these kids are going through. There is good news in all of this. If you look at the overall picture, it sounds really bad, okay? Never in my lifetime has there been a larger percentage of Americans who are absolutely fed up with higher education. The trust in leadership. Have you heard about the admission scandal lately? What do you think about that? Should we be subsidizing higher ed to let the wealthy have better chances to get into colleges? What about this film Starving the Beast, where people are in many states, 6 states, Wisconsin, Virginia, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana. The legislatures have forced the removal of the president of the flagship research university in each of those states in the last 2 years. And their concern is eliminate academic freedom. We've trusted you guys, you've broken the challenge, and now you're producing kids that can't do anything, they can't get a job, and they have a great amount of debt because you keep increasing the price. Starving the Beast is a movie which documents all this. The reason it's called that is their idea is very simple. We will cut off the funding for the state university and watch it implode. And when it goes away and the people leave, we'll rebuild it so that it's job training. That's the answer. I have not seen that in any of the 15 countries that I visited, but it's prominent in the US. So how can there be good news in this, Rick? Here's the good news. When change is needed, and the alternative is I'm going to work the rest of my life at McDonald's, maybe I'll think about a new way of doing education, because I have kids too. It's pretty desperate in a number of places in higher ed, and I think the opportunity for change is real. It's never been this prominent in my lifetime. Not just engineering. We're talking about the 20 times larger group of students in liberal arts. And that brings me to the last bit of this little diatribe. And it's a vision for the future. Okay. So if I could close my eyes and I had a magic wand and I could paint, what is the solution to this? What do we need to do so that America leads again? I would say I would like to have an Olin outcome for all undergraduates in the US. All undergraduates, including the major state universities. Isn't that ridiculous? You couldn't possibly do it. Well, wait a minute. How do you get there? Let's think about this for a while. One of the things that Sally can probably tell you here is if you look at what happens to graduates everywhere, there is a linkage that has to happen between graduation day and placement day when you sign an employment letter for a company. That transition is very different for people at Olin who majored in engineering than they are for people at, let's say, Southwest Louisiana University who majored in anthropology, okay? I'm going to be very unkind for a minute about the way we monitor these things and manage them and say, I will bet that there are 0 companies that called up Southwest Louisiana State University, I'm not even sure there is one of those universities, and asked for a list of the graduates who are going to get a bachelor's degree in anthropology this year. Okay? Because I'm going to be there with my recruiter. Those are the people whose skill sets I want to recruit. And it's not just anthropology, folks. It's a long list of them. We had Howard Gardner in this auditorium in May, who just did a 7-year study of higher education at Harvard. His original thought 7 years ago in 2012 when they created the study was a future of the liberal arts. Did you know he had to change the name of it? Because he couldn't find anybody that knew what the liberal arts were. Okay? He gave up. It's not working. My bold, Olin-esque answer, do away with majors at the undergraduate level. What difference does it make? The idea that you're going to become a miniature PhD in anthropology in 4 years and this is going to set your life forward is silly. Kids spend 2 years trying to figure out what an anthropologist is, okay? Reading in the encyclopedia, is this what I want to be? I don't think that helps. What would you do instead? Okay, well, here's some ideas. And this is not going to work, so don't get excited, folks. And I'm leaving, so you don't have to put up with this for very much longer. So here's what I would do. I would keep the foundation that we have, the basics in math and science that everybody takes, no matter what their major is, and their fundamental exposure to humanities and social science. The program we have is robust and it works really well. It injects people back into the subject. It's integrated. There's no sharp divisions. I think that's all the right thing to do. And then I would simply remove the part of the educational curriculum that has a major title on it. Get rid of that. You can pick that up later. Well, what would you do in the place of that? I would create a process of learning which is student-driven that includes 4 major elements. I'm going to overstate these for shock effect and to make you think, all right? Only study those things that matter. Things that matter to you, things that matter to society, things that matter to somebody you care about. You won't need to go to an encyclopedia to figure out what you're studying. Okay, you'll know why you're doing it. Only study things in context. By the way, how did we get out of context? We did this because of academic disciplines. We had a group of specialists who only teach macroeconomics, and so we take all the problems and we look at them through the lens of microeconomics, and we come out with these theories that only work within the confines of some assumptions. And by the way, if you're really good at this, you take the advanced course, and you get even more out of context, and we never bother to put it back into context before you graduate. We call them a PhD, and then they're experts. Putting things in context is fundamentally important today. The context has never been more complicated. So why don't we just stay in context? I can tell you why they don't want to stay in context, because it takes faculty from different disciplines in the room at the same time. You can't frame the problem if you have only electrical engineers in the room or only historians in the room. But if you have an electrical engineer and a historian in the room, it's not a lecture, it's meet the press. And now we have this debate about what's going on, and people don't forget it, it's relevant, and it has a meaning, okay? Learning things in context. And then learn things in teams. Always learn things in teams. I've never found a company yet who will tell you that What we do at this company is we put people in a cubicle by themselves with a multiple choice test and tell them not to talk to their neighbors, okay? People who do that really well, those are the ones that we promote. It's actually the ones who talk to their neighbors that you promote. This is the idea. Build the skill set of learning to build expertise around a really complex problem in context with people who are very different from you is golden. You will get a job if you can do that. I don't care what label you put on it. This is close to what Tom Friedman was talking about in San Francisco in 2014. Finally, and this is the most important part of it, it's about the purpose of all of these projects. The purpose for these projects in a liberal arts institution is primarily about what I think Mark has characterized at one point. Forgive me, Mark, maybe you don't want to be identified with this. Problematizing the world. The idea is I do my job by studying the science really well and finding somebody to blame for what's wrong, and then dust my hands off and sit down. I've done my job, okay? What if you change that? What if instead of being an expert who can diagnose what other people should do, to a different paradigm, which says your purpose always in all of these projects is to imagine what has never been and do whatever it takes to make a positive impact on the world. Imagine if all of the millions of kids in America thought that being educated meant taking action to fix things when they're broken, like our kids are doing right now in the Frankly Speaking article. Okay, what if the whole country were doing that? This is a shift in paradigm. You might call it entrepreneurial mindset because they're imagining new things that are better. You could call it an engineering mindset because engineers make things that make things better. I don't care what mindset you call it. The thing that would be different, of course, is that they're not necessarily getting an engineering label on their degree. I don't think it would matter. If you look at the placement of Olin graduates today, we have kids graduating in mechanical engineering who are going to Google to write code. Then they're not using those steam tables that you and I studied when we were kids, okay? How valuable was that to what they're doing? I don't doubt for a minute they could pick up the steam tables in graduate school if they had a reason to. The just-in-case knowledge about steam tables is not really useful. If you actually were to do something like this, and I believe back again in our friend Buckminster Fuller, somebody has to develop a real prototype that makes the others obsolete. You have to build one of these because nobody's going to believe it. I mean, Mark and I went to the Mellon Foundation. You know, it's like walking into the Lion's Den. This is the liberal arts community of the world. And we told them, we think liberal arts is obsolete. You know, you should do this. We got out with our lives, which was good. They were polite because they'd heard of Olin. I wouldn't say they were convinced, all right? That's what we wanted to hear was what's wrong with this from their perspective. Somebody will have to build one. Somebody will have to make it. Just as inconvenient as Olin is for a lot of people, if you come here and look at it and you see the kids, they're completely different. Even MIT shakes its head and says, I think we need to do something differently. That's what it's going to take. Olin could do this, okay? This is the big idea. Olin could do this. How could you do it? Let me just blue sky. Suppose we had the ability to increase our intake of students by 25 per year. That's it. These 25 would not be engineers. I don't know exactly what you call them yet. You have to have a design team to think of that. They would study other things, which means that their projects would not be building a widget to do something. Their projects would be looking at things like poverty or peace or well-being or equality, things that are more complicated in society. Those are the kinds of projects they would do, but they do them in the same way. So 25 kids per year. In 4 years, that accumulates to 100 more students on campus. And then our graduation would have like 1/3 mechanical engineers, 1/3 electrical engineers, 1/3 engineers, and 1/3 these other things, whatever we call them, okay? I'm going to say that Olin faculty, if you gave them 5 years to do this, and the freedom to experiment, they would figure it out. And I think the Olin faculty would do better than the faculty at Harvard or Stanford or anywhere else on the planet, because this is what we do at Olin, is we experiment with learning and we understand what kids need. At the end of that 5-year period, Olin would have graduates who think differently than the undergraduates at any other institution. And I think probably because it's Olin, employers would come anyway, because, well, you know, there's a bunch of engineers there. It's probably worth the flight. They would be impressed that they couldn't tell the difference between the kids who had this new major and the old major, and they'd all get jobs, okay? And then if we got enough attention and we were really fortunate, this could wind up being Olin 2.0. Just an idea. Okay, but what would it cost? Well, I don't know, but if you could run the whole thing with one check, an endowment rather than year by year, it's probably in the $50 to $75 million range. You have to build a building, you have to get some new faculty, so forth. There is some tuition that you get, not enough to support it. And if it were wildly successful, so that 10 years from now, this became just like the engineering program in all of the national and international rankings of undergraduate education, Olin is at the top, and everybody's coming here to see it, then we think about parcel B, okay? What about building an entirely new Olin, an Olin College of Liberal Arts, okay, that has Mike Moody's old philosophy here. He says what's wrong with liberal arts is that we've lost our way in requiring rigor in math and science in liberal arts. The rest of it's fine, but we don't have those math teachers. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for my math teacher in high school, Miss Walters. I had her all 4 years, okay? There was only one math class in this high school, and we had the same teacher. Miss Walters wouldn't be there today because we fixed the problem of having no opportunities for women. When she grew up, she had a small menu. You could be a nurse, you could be a secretary, you could be a teacher. Today, she could be an astronaut. I mean, we Needham now has an elementary school named for a Needhamite who's a woman astronaut. She could be a CEO of Google. She could be a CEO of Verizon. She could be anywhere, okay? She probably wouldn't choose to be a math teacher at Tranquility High School, 40 miles from the nearest hospital out in the farmland. And that's happened all over the country. We fixed that. Women now have options, but we didn't backfill the consequences. We don't have math teachers now in a lot of these countries. Something over 90% of the kids who learn math and science in the 5th grade in this country are taught by teachers who do not have a degree in math and science. That's why when they get to college, you have an option. This is like the valedictorian of a famous high school in New York showing up at Princeton. They're not prepared in the same way in math and science that they were a generation ago. What's Princeton going to do? Tell them you guys are, well, I guess you'll have to stay 5 years to get the same education. No, what do? They create new math and science courses for non-majors, okay? There is a math for dummies. There is a physics for politicians. There isn't a poetry for dummies. There isn't a history course for engineers. They take the same courses. The new liberal arts college at Olin would fix that. They'd all come out with the same foundation. Even if you had more of a history bent, you would know how to calculate. You would know how to understand what the planets do when they're rotating around the sun. Very different. Okay, I'm not sure if you're still awake, but it's 5 o'clock. I'm going to stop at this point, and if you do want to ask questions, I would be glad to answer them for a few minutes. Thank you.
I really appreciated the thousands of nuggets of wisdom you just downloaded, and I ask you about transformation. You said that we can't teach if we haven't the lived experience. And how are we, you talked about transformation being identity change. This is totally threatening. You talked about the faculty being critical to this. And clearly there is no absence of a compelling reason, if we listen to Greta Thunberg, for us to be learning. So how are the faculty going to be safe enough to go through this identity change that you're talking about?
Yeah, really good question. I'm not sure I heard every word because the acoustics in the front of the room are not the same as they are in the back. Nevertheless, I'll answer what I think you said, okay? And that's, how are these faculty going to transform people? How do you... Okay. How are they going to be safe enough? Okay. Yeah.
So that they can be functional teachers.
Yeah, that's a form of what I'm trying to say here. How can they be safe enough to take on this task to begin with? That's exactly, by the way, what I'm doing right now with the Kern Foundation and the Coalition for Life Transforming Education. I don't know the formula, but we're learning more every day. One of the things I know for sure, the safe enough question is exactly the right question. There are faculty doing this right now in a lot of these campuses, but they're keeping their head down, right? Not safe enough. They need to talk to the president and the provost. They need to embrace this idea as being foundational to what the mission of the university is in the 21st century. Make it okay. Turns out presidents and provosts can't make things happen. I guarantee that. I am one, okay? I haven't done anything. It's our faculty that did it. But they can sure stop it. They can stop it without even knowing they're stopping it. So the first thing you have to do is get green lights at the top so these people don't get cut off at the knees when they're trying to work on the right problems. We're making some pretty good progress. So 2 years ago, with some wind at my back from the Kern Foundation, who were just as crazy as I am, we decided we'll try to build a small network of universities who are willing to experiment in this area. They need to be large enough, like public universities, that it could make an impact if it actually worked. So how many do you need? We're patterning this after what's happening in medical education, which is also being reinvented right now. Go to medednext.com and you'll see, or .edu. We need about 6. Okay, would they even respond to me? I mean, if you're going to write to, for example, the president of the University of Texas at Austin, and he gets this inbox from the guy who does what? He leads a college with 350 students and all they study is engineering and they don't even have a PhD program? Okay, I'm going to hedge my bets. I'm going to write to 12. Maybe 6 of them will answer. Do you know what happened? All 12 answered. And they all wanted to come. There's much more interest in this than you think. Now our problem is weeding it, okay? Now we have more universities that want to come. Talking with Anna Marie Cauchi at the University of Washington, Seattle, is very interested in this. Dave Williams at Ohio State University believes that their provost and president is on board. Ohio State has 50,000 students, okay? Mitch Daniels at Purdue, who is the one who funded the Gallup Purdue Index, is really interested in it. So maybe we can get them to endorse the idea and make it okay for the faculty members who are doing it. That's the first idea, okay? The next thing is, okay, so you get green lights from the president. What's going to happen now? So we have mini grants programs, and with help from Lauren, for example, who had a brilliant idea of taking the Kern money we have there and making little grants, figuring that the real value of grant opportunity is not the dollars, it's the time you spend writing the proposal. You meet new people, the genie comes out of the bottle, now you really have a belief in this, and now you want to do it, even if you don't get the money. So let's start with giving them a reason to sit in the same room and develop a vision for what they could do. And we're now creating a grants program for all of these dozen universities. We're going to meet on December 10th at Chicago Airport. We have some exemplars of universities that are doing it. Our guest speaker this time is Clayton Spencer, who's the president of Bates College. Why are we inviting her? In 7 years, she's developed a project there called Purposeful Work. Okay, purposeful work. Every graduate at liberal arts college is now at Bates is going into a job that they have not postponed thinking about until 20 minutes before they got their diploma. They've been thinking about this for 4 years. They've been aiming themselves. They've had internships. Even if you're an English major at Bates, you have an internship. You also have recent graduates within the last 2 or 3 years come back to the campus. They're folded into the courses to tell their classmates, this is what I experienced when I left Bates and I wanted to be a writer at the New York Times. I went down there and I spent the summer there and this is what I found out they're looking for. And the alumni also told Bates, tell your faculty to be more realistic, okay? You're setting expectations that these kids are going to change the world in 20 minutes after they graduate. They find out that the company thinks it's nice to change the world, but they actually have to make money. And somehow that has to be figured in to what it means to be a successful Bates graduate. In 7 years, the Gallup data shows, a sample of 2,000, Bates graduates are an order of magnitude 10 times higher on the well-being index than the graduates of other liberal arts colleges in America. And what she's doing is completely scalable. You could do that at Ohio State, okay? Yes, the president would have to change their fundraising. They'd have to ask money for internships for English majors, not just engineers. They didn't have too much trouble getting it done at Bates. I'll bet you could do it there too, if it were a priority. So we don't know how to do it. We're experimenting. I think something big is going to happen in the U.S. in this area because the unhappiness with what we're doing now has never been this high. Anybody else? Look, I'm standing between you and dinner, so.
This is a quick one. First one is, will you share your notes?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure you'll be able to make sense of it. Yeah, it's a long talk. It's not a short question. I will just say this. Tenure is not the boogeyman we think it is. Tenure, I know just as many creative people at universities who have tenure as I know people who don't. But there's something underlying tenure that is a problem, which is peer review, okay? And that's a long discussion. Peer review tends to be a very regressive kind of metric because it makes all of the faculty members subject to the secret opinions of other faculty members about the credibility of what they're doing. It can be the most powerful tool for creating innovation when it's done right, and I think Olin does a really good job. But just eliminating tenure at Ohio State, for example, would not necessarily result in creativity. In fact, if you look at the statistics, Ralph, the percentage of faculty members today that are tenured anywhere in America is much lower than they were 10 years ago. Universities are doing away with tenure now. I just got back from the University of Connecticut 2 weeks ago. Turns out that they call them, it's something like visiting professors. These are non-tenured professors that have all the credentials of the regular tenured faculty. They're folded into the departments in the same way. They teach the same courses. They supervise PhD classes. They just don't have tenure. And I asked them, will all departments accept this? No, they're in the process. Some departments accept them exactly the same as everyone else. Other departments have this sort of arm's length thing. I think the institution of tenure is not growing, it's shrinking in America, whether we recognize it and talk about it or not. And if you did away with it today, it wouldn't be the shocking change that you think. But you could create a huge culture change if you really address the issue of peer review and how peer review works. And even more fundamental, besides peer review, is what our faculty did here at Olin, redevelop or rethink the whole contract of what successful faculty behavior means. It's not about teaching, research, and service at Olin. Those are three independent buckets. It's a Venn diagram, and they intersect. So instead of teaching, it's building student success. Instead of research, I think it's nationally visible achievement. Okay? Instead of service, it's building the institutional success. And our folks are doing a wonderful job of pioneering this new way of thinking about success, and that could spread to any university, even if they had tenure. I think it would transform what they're doing. Aren't you guys hungry? Any more questions? Okay, thank you.